There is a story the Heiltsuk people of the central British Columbia coast have carried for longer than anyone can measure. It describes a stretch of coastline that does not exist anymore. It talks about a lowland place, a wide, flat country where their ancestors lived before the sea came up and took it. For a long time, researchers who heard versions of this story filed it away as mythology, a parable about impermanence, maybe, a poetic way of talking about loss. Then, in 2017, archaeologists diving off the coast of Calvert Island pulled something out of the seafloor sediment that changed the entire conversation. They found human footprints, 3 sets of them, pressed into what was once a mudflat, preserved under the ocean where no one had looked for them, dating back 14,000 years. The Heiltsuk had not been telling a myth, they had been telling history, and that is only one thread in what turns out to be an enormous and largely unexamined story. Because across this country, from the Pacific rainforests to the boreal interior to the rocky coasts of the Atlantic, the Indigenous peoples of Canada have preserved accounts of a world that came before their world, a time before the landscape looked the way it looks now. A people, or peoples, who were already here, who built things, who knew things, who left marks behind that the nations who came after them could recognize, but could not fully explain. Some of these accounts describe a civilization, some describe a presence, some describe something in between, a class of beings so far removed from ordinary human experience that the languages trying to contain them bent and stretched around the edges of what words could hold. Modern archaeology is only beginning to catch up. The tools are new enough, and the coastlines are deep enough, and the forests are dense enough that enormous amounts of evidence have simply not been found yet. What is being found, year by year, is rewriting what was thought to be known about the deep human past of North America, and the oral traditions that the people of this land carried through thousands of years of upheaval are starting to look less like legend and more like the most durable archive that survived. This is going to take a while to tell properly. There is no short version of this story. It reaches too far back, and it touches too many places, and the pieces of it are still coming out of the ground, but the shape of it is there. You can see it if you look at enough of the evidence together. Something was here for a very long time, and then something changed, and what was here became a memory, and the memory became a story, and the story is what we are looking at now. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. The first thing to understand is the coastline itself. Not the coastline that exists now, with its deep channels and island archipelagos and the dramatic fjord country of British Columbia, but the coastline that existed during and just after the last ice age, when sea levels were substantially lower than they are today. During the peak of glaciation, roughly 20,000 years ago, so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice that ocean levels sat somewhere between 100 and 130 meters below where they are now. The continental shelf off the west coast of Canada, which drops away steeply from the modern shoreline, was at that time dry land. Not just a little dry land, enormous tracts of it. The area now submerged off the coast of British Columbia alone represents hundreds of thousands of hectares that were once above the waterline, and some of that land, particularly around Haida Gwaii and the northern coast, was ice-free, while the interior was still locked under the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. This is not a minor detail. It means that for thousands of years, the most habitable, resource-rich strip of land on the entire western edge of North America was not where we have been looking for evidence of early human occupation. It was underwater, the shoreline where people would have lived, fished, gathered shellfish, built shelters, raised children, buried their dead, and left all the material traces of their existence, was sitting under anywhere from 20 to 100 meters of ocean water, and it had been sitting there for 10,000 years before anyone thought to look for it. The Heiltsuk footprints, found in 2017, were not a fluke. They were the result of a deliberate underwater archaeological survey specifically designed to test what the oral traditions were saying. The research team from the Hakai Institute, working in partnership with the Heiltsuk Nation, was operating on the premise that if the stories described a real landscape, there should be physical evidence on the drowned seafloor. They were correct. The footprints they found were accompanied by other features, remnants of what appears to be a working area where people processed materials, used fire, organized their activities in ways that indicate not temporary transit, but actual habitation. The date, 14,000 years ago, placed occupation of that coastline at a time when the interior of the continent was still largely impassable ice. What this means for the broader question of how North America was first peopled is still being debated in academic circles with considerable heat. For decades, the dominant model held that humans entered the Americas from Asia via the Beringia land bridge and then moved south through an ice-free corridor that opened between the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets somewhere around 13,000 years ago. That model is now under substantial pressure from multiple directions, not least from the physical evidence accumulating along the Pacific coast. A route down the coast, using the ice-free refugia and the kelp highway that ran from Japan to Alaska and down to California, carrying people who were already experienced maritime foragers, is now considered at least as plausible as the interior corridor model, and possibly more so. But the deeper question, the one that this story is really about, is not just when people arrived. It is what they built after they arrived, and how long they had to build it, and what happened to what they built when the sea came for it. Because the sea did come for it. Over thousands of years, as the glaciers melted, the water rose. It did not rise evenly or predictably. There were pulses, moments of rapid flooding when ice dams gave way, and enormous volumes of meltwater surged into the ocean all at once. There were slower periods of gradual encroachment, but the net result, played out over roughly 8,000 years, was the drowning of the entire coastal shelf. The loss of what may have been the longest occupied stretch of territory in North American prehistory, and the displacement of the peoples who lived there onto higher ground, where their descendants have remained ever since. The Heiltsuk oral tradition is specific about this. It does not describe a vague ancestral time or a mythological before. It describes a geography. It names places. The underwater survey confirmed that some of those named places correspond to actual features on the drowned seafloor. Features that would have been visible landmarks on a dry coastline. This is what a living oral tradition looks like when it is working correctly. It is not poetry, it is cartography. The words are the map, and the map is accurate. And the map has been accurate for 14,000 years, because the people who held it understood that their survival depended on passing it forward without distortion. This pattern of oral traditions encoding precise geographical and historical information across enormous spans of time, is not unique to the Heiltsuk. It has been documented among Aboriginal Australians, whose stories of coastal flooding events have been cross-referenced with geological data and found to describe sea level changes from between 7,000 and 13,000 years ago with a degree of accuracy that is genuinely significant. It has been identified in traditions from Polynesia, from South Asia, from the Mediterranean. What makes the Canadian examples particularly striking is how many of them there are, how geographically distributed they are, and how consistently they point toward the same conclusion. There was a prior world, there were people in it, the world changed, and what was lost was enormous. The Haida of Haida Gwaii, the archipelago off the northern coast of British Columbia that was one of those key ice-free refugia during the last glacial maximum, carry traditions of a time when their islands were connected to the mainland by a wide lowland plain. They describe ancestors who lived on that plain, who fished rivers that no longer exist in their original form, who knew the land before the sea had its current shape. Haida Gwaii was ice-free, while most of the continent was under glaciers, and genetic and archaeological evidence confirms that the islands were indeed occupied by humans during the late glacial period. The oldest confirmed human presence on Haida Gwaii dates to approximately 13,000 years ago, but the nature of what is found in those early sites suggests people who were already highly adapted to their environment, not explorers passing through, but a population with deep local knowledge. The Haida description of their outer coast as younger land that the sea has recently released, is accurate. Parts of the archipelago are still rising from isostatic rebound as the weight of the glaciers continues to lift, and the outer coast is geologically newer than the inner coast in precisely the way the oral tradition describes. What the Haida traditions also preserve, and this is the part that takes longer to sit with, is an awareness that the people who occupied the pre-flooding lowlands were not simply ancestors in the ordinary sense. Some accounts describe them as a distinct people, or as people who understood the land in ways that were already ancient by the time the Haida began their own continuous occupation of the islands. This is a recurring feature of Indigenous oral traditions across Canada. The people being remembered are not simply the grandparents of the people doing the remembering. They are something older, something that was already in place when the current peoples arrived, or something that the current peoples encountered in the deep past and recognized as different, as prior, as belonging to a time before the present order of things. The Stalo Nation of the Fraser River Valley in British Columbia center of much of their spiritual geography on a concept called transformation. The idea that the world in its current form was shaped by powerful beings who moved through an earlier, more fluid version of reality and fixed things into their present shapes. The transformer figures in Stalo tradition are not creator gods in the Western theological sense. They are more like engineers. They solved specific problems. They established specific conditions. They left specific marks that can still be seen. One of the most famous of these marks is XA, Whitem, known in English as Hatzik Rock, a massive granite boulder near Mission, British Columbia that the Stalo identify as 3 transformed people who were turned to stone by the transformer XXRLs. The site has been shown by archaeologists to have been a gathering place for at least 9,000 years. 9,000 years of continuous use and cultural significance, extending back to a time when the landscape of the Fraser Valley looked substantially different from what it looks like now. The archaeological interpretation of Whitem tends to focus on what can be measured and dated. The Stalo interpretation carries additional information that archaeology cannot access directly. The rock marks a place where something happened, something that involved an encounter between the transformer beings and a prior order of things that needed to be changed or contained. The people who were transformed into the rock were not random individuals. In the oral tradition, they are described as people who possessed a knowledge that was causing problems, a knowledge that needed to be locked away or fixed in place so that it could not spread further in its original form. This is not a story about punishment. It is a story about containment, about the management of an extremely old and powerful set of information that the world was not ready to hold freely. This reading of the transformer traditions as encoding memories of an encounter between incoming peoples and a pre-existing population with knowledge and capabilities that the newcomers found both valuable and dangerous is not the mainstream academic interpretation. It is, however, consistent with what the traditions actually describe if you take them seriously as historical accounts rather than as mythology. And taking Indigenous oral traditions seriously as historical accounts is something that archaeology has only recently begun to do with any systematic rigor, driven largely by the accumulating physical evidence that keeps confirming what the stories have been saying. The Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes region and the Boreal Shield carry traditions of a people called the Meme-Gwashi, sometimes described as small beings who lived in the cliff faces above the lakes and rivers and who were responsible for the pictographs found across the Canadian Shield. The Anishinaabe are clear that they did not make these paintings. They are equally clear that the Meme-Gwashi did. The pictographs in question, found at sites like Agawa Rock on Lake Superior and at hundreds of locations across northern Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba, are attributed in the oral tradition to a people who predated Anishinaabe occupation of the territory. They are described as beings who lived in a different relationship with the physical world, who could pass through rock, who traveled by canoe but also traveled by routes that ordinary canoes could not navigate. The paintings they left behind are described as communications, as records, as warnings and instructions, encoded in a visual language that the Anishinaabe could recognize as meaningful but could not always fully decode. The pictographs themselves are extraordinary, and the debate about who made them and how old they are is far from settled. Some sites show clear evidence of Anishinaabe cultural continuity, with figures and symbols that correspond to documented Anishinaabe spiritual traditions. But others show symbols that do not fit neatly into the known Anishinaabe visual vocabulary, and the relationships between sites suggest planning and coordination across distances that imply a sophisticated territorial network. The ochre used in many of the paintings has been dated in some cases to periods well before the documented expansion of Anishinaabe culture into certain territories, which raises the question of what population was in those territories before the Anishinaabe arrived. The Anishinaabe themselves do not regard this as a confusing question. They know who was there before them. The Meme-Gwashi were there. They left the paintings. They are still there in some form, still associated with the cliff faces and the deep water below them, still present in a way that makes the painting sites places of real power and real risk. The question of whether this constitutes evidence of an actual pre-Anishinaabe population with a distinct material culture, or whether it is an entirely internal spiritual tradition with no external referent, is a question that the academic discipline of archaeology is just beginning to engage with seriously. The traditions themselves are not confused about it. Something was there. Something left marks. Those marks are still there to be seen. Moving east and north into the territory of the Dene peoples, who occupy enormous swaths of the boreal forest and the subarctic, from the Mackenzie Delta to the interior of northern Quebec, the oral traditions carry accounts of a warm time, a time before the current cold, when the land looked different and supported different kinds of life. Dene elders have described to researchers traditions of a landscape with large lakes that have since dried up, with tree lines that extended further north than they do now, with a warmth in the land that the present climate does not have. This is not mythological embellishment. There was a warm period in the early Holocene, roughly 8,000 to 5,000 years ago, when temperatures across northern North America were measurably higher than today, when the tree line was substantially further north, when lakes that are now shallow or dry were full and productive. The Dene traditions describing this period are accurate descriptions of an actual climatic and ecological reality that preceded the current landscape. What those traditions also describe, alongside the warm landscape, are the people who lived in it. Not ancestors in the direct genealogical sense, but prior peoples. People who had their own relationship with that warmer land, who left their own marks on it, and who are remembered as distinct from the Dene themselves. Some of these accounts describe builders, people who constructed things in stone or in landscape forms that do not match Dene architectural traditions. Some describe people with different physical characteristics. Some simply describe a presence, an awareness that the land had been intensively occupied before the current peoples arrived, and that what the current peoples inherited was a landscape already shaped by that prior occupation. The difficulty with all of this, for anyone trying to build a coherent picture, is that the evidence is genuinely scattered and genuinely incomplete. The oral traditions point at things. Some of those things can be found in the archaeological record. Others cannot, or cannot yet, because they are underwater or under permafrost or simply have not been excavated. The traditions were not designed to provide convenient academic proof. They were designed to preserve what was essential for survival, what was spiritually and practically important to the people who held them. The fact that they preserve accurate geographical and historical information is almost a side effect of their primary purpose, which was to maintain the relationship between a people and their land across generations. The historical precision is a product of the care with which the stories were maintained, not a deliberate archival project. But when you lay enough of these traditions side by side, and when you look at what the physical evidence is beginning to show, a shape emerges, and the shape is this. North America was occupied for much longer than the textbook timeline suggests, by peoples with more sophisticated relationships to their environments than the standard models acknowledge. And something happened, or a series of things happened, that disrupted or ended what those peoples had built and left the land in a condition that looked, to the people who came after, like it had once supported something that was no longer there. What that something was is the question this story is trying to approach. And to approach it properly, you have to go back to the coastline, because that is where the oldest and most abundant evidence is pointing, and that is where the oral traditions are most specific about what was lost. The site at Keatley Creek in the interior plateau of British Columbia is not well known outside of archaeological circles, and that is a problem that deserves more attention than it gets. It sits in the dry canyon country above the Fraser River in Secwepemc territory, and what it represents is one of the most complex pre-contact settlement systems ever documented in Canada. The site contains the remnants of more than 115 pit house depressions, ranging from small family structures to enormous communal lodges that would have housed dozens of people. At its peak occupation, around 1,500 years ago, Keatley Creek was home to a population that archaeologists estimate at somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people, making it one of the largest prehistoric settlements on the entire Pacific slope of North America. It had a social hierarchy. It had a sophisticated food storage system centered on the massive salmon runs of the Fraser River. It had spatial organization that reflects deliberate planning, with specific areas of the settlement dedicated to specific activities. And then it was abandoned. The abandonment of Keatley Creek and of the entire plateau sequence of large winter villages that it represents is not well explained by the available evidence. The salmon runs that supported the population did not disappear. The climate did not catastrophically deteriorate. The evidence suggests some combination of resource pressure and social reorganization, but the precise mechanism is not clear. What is clear is that the people who built Keatley Creek were not simply doing what their descendants described them as doing. The Secwepemc oral traditions regarding the site are specific that it was built by people who had particular knowledge of how to organize a community of that size, knowledge that included engineering principles for the large pithouse structures, water management, and food preservation at a scale that required coordination across the entire settlement. The traditions also describe, with some consistency, an awareness that the knowledge embodied in Keatley Creek was itself inherited from an earlier time, that the builders of the great pit houses were drawing on a body of understanding about landscape and construction and social organization that had not originated with them. This layering of inheritance, the sense that what is being practiced now was learned from someone who learned it, from someone who learned it from a time that is now very far away, is a recurring feature of Secwepemc accounts of the interior plateau, and it points toward a question that the archaeology of the region has not fully answered. What was the source of the organizational and technical sophistication that produced settlements like Keatley Creek? The standard archaeological answer focuses on the development of intensive salmon fishing technology, specifically the development of large-scale weir and trap systems that could harvest enough fish to support dense sedentary winter populations. This is a real and important development, but it does not fully account for the social and organizational complexity of the largest sites, or for the engineering skill evident in the construction of the largest pit houses, which required precise calculation of roof loads, drainage angles, and insulation depth to maintain habitable temperatures through interior plateau winters that regularly dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. This is not the kind of knowledge that a group of people invents from scratch in a single generation. It is the kind of knowledge that accumulates over many generations of building, testing, failing, refining, and trying again. The question is where that accumulation happened. If the large village tradition on the interior plateau peaked around 1500 years ago, then the knowledge base that made those villages possible must have been developing for considerably longer. And indeed, pit house sites on the interior plateau extend back much further than Keatley Creek's peak occupation. Some of the earliest evidence of pit house construction in the region dates to more than 7,000 years ago. 7,000 years of experimentation with a particular form of architecture in a particular environment, producing at its peak a settlement of 2,000 people governed by social rules, sophisticated enough to manage resource distribution, conflict resolution, and collective labor coordination. That is a civilization in any reasonable sense of the word. The Secwepemc did not think of themselves as the inventors of that tradition. They thought of themselves as the inheritors of it, the most recent people to have learned a set of practices that reached back into a time they could not fully see. And they described, in their accounts of that inheritance, people who came before them on the plateau who had their own ways of knowing the land, ways that were different from the Secwepemc ways, but that had left their mark on the landscape in forms that could still be recognized. Moving east across the Rockies, into the territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the oral traditions take a different form, but address a recognizable set of questions. The Blackfoot Winter Count, the annual pictographic record kept by designated historians within the community, extends back further than the surviving painted hides can confirm, because the practice itself, the systematic recording of one significant event per year, in a visual format that could be read by anyone trained in the tradition, is described in Blackfoot oral accounts as something they inherited, not something they invented. The origin accounts of the Winter Count describe it as a practice that came to the Blackfoot from beings associated with the sky, figures who are described in ways that make them distinct from ordinary human teachers. They brought with them not just the practice of recording time, but specific knowledge about the stars and about the relationship between celestial cycles and the movements of the buffalo herds that the Blackfoot depended on. This astronomical component of Blackfoot tradition is not incidental. The Blackfoot were sophisticated astronomical observers, tracking the movements of stars and planets with a precision that served practical purposes. The rising and setting of specific stars marked the beginning and end of seasonal activities, directed the timing of communal hunts, and guided movements across the plains. Elder astronomers within the community maintained knowledge of long cycles, of patterns that played out over periods longer than a single human lifetime. This knowledge was encoded in stories about specific named stars and their relationships to each other and to the horizon, and it was preserved with a care that reflected its importance. The people who got the buffalo movements wrong did not eat well. The people whose astronomical knowledge was accurate survived winters that killed those without it. The traditions describing where this knowledge came from are consistent in pointing toward a time before the Blackfoot occupied the plains in their current form. The sky teachers, the figures who brought the star knowledge, are associated with a period when the landscape itself was different, when the plains extended in different directions, when the rivers ran in different places. This is geographically accurate. The drainage patterns of the northern plains changed substantially over the period since the last glaciation, with major rivers shifting their courses as the ice retreated. An isostatic rebound lifted different portions of the land at different rates. The Blackfoot traditions describing this landscape predate the current drainage pattern, meaning they carry information about a geography that has not existed for thousands of years. They preserved it because it was attached to the astronomical knowledge, and the astronomical knowledge was too important to lose any detail of the context in which it had been transmitted. The medicine wheels of the northern plains add a physical dimension to this picture that archaeology has struggled to fully account for. These stone structures, built on high ridges and exposed hilltops across southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the northern United States, are among the most enigmatic constructions in North American prehistory. The largest and best documented, the Majorville Cairn and Medicine Wheel in southern Alberta, has been in use for more than 5,000 years. The stone cairn at its centre has been built up by successive additions over that entire span, and surrounding it is a complex arrangement of stone spokes radiating outward in patterns that correspond to specific astronomical alignments. The alignment of the Majorville Wheel to the summer solstice sunrise and to the rising of specific stars used in Blackfoot calendrical practice has been confirmed by multiple independent astronomical analyses. What this means is that someone was conducting astronomical observations on that hill 5,000 years ago with enough precision to align a stone structure to celestial events, and that the site has been maintained and used continuously for that entire period. 5,000 years of continuous astronomical observation from a single hilltop location. That is the kind of long institutional practice that requires an organizational structure capable of transmitting technical knowledge across hundreds of generations without significant degradation. It requires, in other words, something that functions like a civilization, even if it does not look like one from the outside. The Blackfoot do not claim to have built Majorville. They say they inherited it, that they came to the plains and found the wheel already there, and that they learned its use from the beings or peoples who had maintained it before them. This is an uncomfortable position for standard archaeological thinking, because it implies an earlier occupation of the northern plains with a level of astronomical sophistication that the standard timeline struggles to accommodate. The earliest human presence in the region documented by archaeology predates the Majorville Wheel by many thousands of years, but the gap between the earliest presence and the construction of a precisely aligned stone astronomical instrument is not smoothly filled by the available evidence. Something happened in that gap, something that produced the knowledge and motivation to build Majorville, and the physical record of it is sparse enough that the oral traditions about it remain one of the most significant sources of information. The Moose Mountain Medicine Wheel in Saskatchewan is older than Majorville by some calculations, and its astronomical alignments are even more precise. The wheel aligns not only to the summer solstice sunrise, but to the heliacal rising of Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius, three stars whose simultaneous rising with the sun mark the beginning of specific seasons in a calendar system of considerable sophistication. The precision of these alignments has been calculated by archaeoastronomers who found that the alignments were accurate for a period beginning around 2,500 years ago, placing the original construction, or at least the final calibration of the wheel, in that period. But the site has features that suggest earlier construction beneath the current configuration, and the oral traditions associated with it reach back substantially further than the archaeological dating of the visible structure. The Cree nations, whose territory includes Moose Mountain, describe the wheel as a site of power that was already ancient when their ancestors first encountered it, a place maintained by peoples who understood its purpose and who passed that understanding to the Cree, along with the responsibility for the site's continuation. The Cree accounts of those earlier keepers describe them as distinct from the Cree, as people who had come from a different direction and who carried knowledge of the sky that was not originally a Cree tradition. This is a consistent feature of the medicine wheel traditions across the plains. They are not described as inventions of the nations who currently maintain them. They are described as inheritances, things passed forward from people whose identity has become blurred by time but whose knowledge has not. The petroglyphs at Peterborough, Ontario, represent a different kind of mystery, one that has generated more controversy and more genuine puzzlement than almost any other site in Canadian archaeology. The site, a large flat outcrop of crystalline limestone in the Kawartha Lakes region of central Ontario, bears more than 900 carved figures, arranged in a complex that covers roughly 55 meters in length. The carvings include recognizable Indigenous imagery, figures associated with Algonquian spiritual traditions, shamanic figures, animals, and symbols that have clear parallels in the documented visual cultures of the Anishinaabe and other Algonquian peoples. And then there are other figures that do not fit neatly into any documented Indigenous visual tradition, symbols that look, to various observers over the years, like writing systems from other parts of the world. The scholarly debate about the Peterborough petroglyphs is intense and unresolved. The mainstream archaeological position attributes all the carvings to Indigenous peoples of the woodland tradition, operating over a period extending from roughly 800 years ago back possibly several thousand years. The site was and is considered sacred by the Anishinaabe, who call it Kinumaga Wapkong, meaning the rocks that teach, and Anishinaabe knowledge keepers have described it as a site of learning and spiritual transmission. Some of the symbols, they say, encode specific kinds of knowledge in forms that initiated readers can interpret. Other symbols, they acknowledge, are older than Anishinaabe memory of the site, predating their arrival in the territory and belonging to a tradition they recognize as distinct from their own. This acknowledgement by the people who consider themselves custodians of the site that some of its content predates their cultural memory is significant. It is not a concession to outside academic arguments. It is an internal tradition about the nature of the site itself. The Anishinaabe did not make all of these carvings. They know this. They describe other makers, earlier makers whose relationship to the site was different from their own. Who those makers were is what remains uncertain, and the uncertainty is genuine on all sides. The physical site does not resolve it. The carvings that resist standard Algonquian attribution are real features of the rock. They are not misidentifications or wishful thinking. What they are is genuinely unclear, and the range of explanations that have been proposed, from pre-Columbian Norse to Phoenician to an unknown pre-Algonquian Indigenous tradition, reflects the depth of that unclarity. The most intellectually honest position, and also the least satisfying one, is that something is on that rock that does not fit the standard account, and the standard account does not have a ready explanation for it. The Anishinaabe oral tradition says that what is on that rock is older than Anishinaabe presence in the territory, and was put there by people who used the rock for purposes of knowledge transmission in a time before Anishinaabe memory reaches. That is a statement that should be taken seriously as a data point, not dismissed as legend, and not uncritically incorporated into theories about Viking runestones or ancient Mediterranean mariners. It points toward a real question about who occupied the territory before the documented peoples arrived, and what that occupation looked like. This question, repeated in different forms across the country, begins to constitute something more than a collection of local anomalies. It begins to suggest a pattern. The pattern is this: Indigenous peoples across Canada, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast, from the northern boreal to the southern plains, preserve traditions of a prior occupation of their territories by people who were distinct from them, who possessed knowledge that the current peoples inherited imperfectly or partially, and who left physical marks on the landscape that the current peoples recognize as meaningful but cannot always fully interpret. The consistency of this pattern across independent traditions from peoples with no documented contact with each other is one of the most significant and least discussed features of the Indigenous oral record of Canada. The Old Copper Complex is a name given by archaeologists to a prehistoric tradition of copper working that flourished in the Great Lakes region and extended across enormous distances through trade and cultural exchange. It is old. The dates for the earliest old copper material, based on radiocarbon analysis of organic materials found with copper objects in burial contexts, extend back somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 years before the present. This makes the Old Copper Complex one of the oldest metalworking traditions in human history. Not bronze, not iron, but native copper, hammered and annealed by peoples who understood the thermal properties of the metal well enough to produce objects of sophisticated design. Socketed spear points, fish hooks, awls, gouges, axes, beads, and ornamental forms that required multiple heating and hammering cycles to achieve their final shape. The geographic distribution of old copper material extends from the primary source areas around Lake Superior and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, north and east through Ontario, Quebec and the Maritime provinces, and west through Wisconsin and Minnesota into the Dakotas. Copper artifacts from old copper contexts have been found in burial sites across the eastern half of the continent, indicating a trade network of impressive reach and duration. The peoples who made old copper objects and the peoples who received them through trade did not leave written records, and the cultural identities of those peoples have not been definitively established by archaeology. The relationship between old copper traditions and the later Hopewell and Mississippian traditions that archaeologists know better is a subject of ongoing research. What the oral traditions of the Great Lakes region say about copper is specific and consistent. Copper is not simply a material. It is a substance with spiritual significance and history, a substance that came into human use through relationships with beings or peoples who understood its nature in ways that ordinary humans did not. The Anishinaabe accounts of copper on Lake Superior describe the metal as belonging, in its primary form, to beings called the Mishebeshu, the Great Lynx, water beings who controlled the lake's depths and who were associated with the most powerful and dangerous manifestations of copper's properties. Human use of copper was possible only through negotiation with these beings, through the maintenance of proper relationships, through an ongoing acknowledgement that the copper belonged to a prior order of things and was merely lent to human use. This is not a story about discovery or invention. It is a story about inheritance, about a material and a technology that were encountered in an already existing form and incorporated into human practice through a relationship with the beings or peoples who had already developed it. The question of who those beings or peoples were, stripped of the spiritual register and examined as a historical question, is one that archaeology has not been able to answer fully. The Old Copper Complex appears in the archaeological record with a sophistication in its earliest forms that suggests either a very long prior developmental period that has not yet been documented, or the adoption of an existing tradition by a population that learned it from somewhere else. The northern extensions of old copper culture into the boreal shield of Ontario and Quebec and further into the subarctic are less well documented than the core Great Lakes material, but are no less significant for the larger question. Copper artifacts from contexts that may be associated with old copper traditions have been found in areas of northern Ontario and western Quebec that represent some of the least archaeologically surveyed territory in the country. The surveys that have been done have produced results that suggest a density of pre-contact human activity in the boreal shield substantially greater than was assumed 20 years ago. The Mushkegowuk Cree of the Hudson Bay lowlands, whose territory encompasses some of the most isolated and least studied land in North America, preserve oral accounts of finding worked stone and worked copper in places that their ancestors regarded as markers of a prior people, a people who had used the land before the Cree and who had left physical evidence of their presence in forms that the Cree could recognize as made by humans but could not attribute to any known group. Some of these markers, described in Cree oral tradition as stone carvings found along rivers in the interior, may correspond to the carved stones and petroglyphs that have been documented sporadically in the region, but have received very little systematic study. The Hudson Bay lowlands are not easy terrain to survey. They are vast, seasonally flooded, and characterized by the kind of landscape that does not preserve organic materials well and that makes systematic archaeological survey extremely difficult. What has been found there has mostly been found by accident, by Cree hunters and trappers who know the land intimately and who have been describing what they find to researchers willing to listen. The resulting picture is incomplete but suggestive. There is more there than the standard accounts acknowledge, and some of what is there points toward a prior occupation that has not been adequately characterized by the existing archaeological literature. The Mi'kmaq of the Maritime Provinces and the Gulf of St. Lawrence region carry one of the most specifically described sets of traditions about prior peoples anywhere in the Canadian Indigenous oral record. They speak of a time, long before the current world took its present shape, when the land between what is now Nova Scotia and the island of Newfoundland was not divided by water, when the Gulf of St. Lawrence was a different place, and the land was accessible in ways that are no longer possible. They describe beings called the Wicklap-Mujk, sometimes translated loosely as little people, but carrying a significance that the diminutive term does not fully convey. These are not fairy tale creatures. They are described as beings who understood stone in a way that ordinary humans do not, who worked it in ways that went beyond ordinary tool-making, who produced objects and structures from stone that operated according to principles the Mi'kmaq recognized as purposeful but did not always understand. The Wicklap-Mujk are associated in Mi'kmaq tradition with specific locations, particularly with coastal cliffs and rocky outcroppings where unusual stone formations exist. They are described as the makers of certain stone structures and carved features that the Mi'kmaq encountered when they moved through the landscape and recognized as old in a way that was different from anything within their own memory. The Mi'kmaq acknowledgement that these structures predate their own presence in the territory is consistent with what is known about the timing and nature of Mi'kmaq cultural development in the Maritimes, and it points toward a question that maritime archaeology has been addressing with increasing seriousness in recent years. What was the occupation history of the coastal maritime zone during the period of drastically lower sea levels, and what happened to that history when the sea rose? The Maritimes experienced sea level changes after the last glaciation that were among the most dramatic anywhere in North America. The combined effects of ice sheet melting and isostatic rebound, the springing back of the land as the enormous weight of the ice lifted, produced a complex and spatially variable pattern of sea level changes that flooded some coastal areas while lifting others above the waterline. In parts of the Bay of Fundy, for example, early post-glacial sea levels were substantially lower than today, and the land that is now the ocean floor of the bay was dry and inhabited. In other parts of the Maritimes, the timing of rebound and flooding was different, with some areas experiencing early flooding followed by partial emergence as the land lifted, creating a shifting and complex coastal geography that changed substantially over the millennia following deglaciation. The implication of this for the archaeological record of early human occupation in the Maritimes is significant. The most likely places for dense early occupation, the coastal lowlands with access to marine resources, are now underwater. The sites that have been found on the current land surface represent inland occupation or high elevation sites that were habitable even during lower sea levels. They are not the complete picture. They are what survived the flooding. And what survived, as elsewhere in Canada, tells a story that is almost certainly a partial and distorted version of the actual history of the region. Mi'kmaq traditions also describe a category of beings, or people called the Memegwesi, sometimes identified with the Memegwashi of Anishinaabe tradition through linguistic comparison, but also carrying distinct Mi'kmaq characteristics. These are river people, associated with rocky river environments and with canoe travel, described as skilled craftspeople who produced objects of unusual quality and who were capable of disappearing into cliffs or underwater rather than fleeing overland. They are credited in some accounts with teaching the Mi'kmaq specific crafts and with leaving behind specific objects of workstone that are recognized as Memegwesi work rather than Mi'kmaq work. The existence of this category a distinct prior people associated with stoneworking and specific landscape features in the traditions of a nation geographically separated from the Anishinaabe by hundreds of kilometers, is one of those points of convergence that demands serious attention. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge what is not being claimed. This story is not arguing that there was a single unified civilization spanning the entire continent before the arrival of the peoples we now know as Indigenous Canadians. The evidence does not support that conclusion. What it does support is the conclusion that the territories now occupied by those peoples were previously occupied by populations whose material culture, landscape knowledge, and organizational sophistication reached levels that are only beginning to be appreciated, and that those populations left traces in the landscape and in the oral traditions of their successors that point toward a scale of prior human achievement that the standard narrative of North American prehistory does not adequately accommodate. The distinction matters because the question being asked here is not whether there was a single lost empire. The question is whether the standard account, in which North America before Columbus was a relatively recently settled continent with relatively simple social organization outside of a few well-known exceptions like the Mississippian culture and the Pacific Northwest, chiefdoms, is accurate. And the answer from multiple independent lines of evidence is that it is not accurate. The continent was more densely settled, more socially complex, more organizationally sophisticated, and more deeply known by its inhabitants than the standard account suggests. And some of what was built and known was built and known by peoples who came before the peoples we have been studying, peoples who left memories of themselves in the oral traditions of their successors, and physical traces of themselves in a landscape that is only now, slowly, beginning to be examined with the tools and the methodological humility that the question deserves. The archaeology of Prince Rupert Harbour on the northern coast of British Columbia exemplifies this situation with particular clarity. The harbour, in the traditional territory of the Tsimshian, contains what is now recognized as one of the largest and oldest burial complexes in North America. Archaeological investigations, beginning in the 1960s and continuing through subsequent decades, have revealed a continuous sequence of occupation extending back more than 5,000 years, with a burial population numbering in the thousands. The cemetery complex represents one of the most concentrated accumulations of human burials anywhere in Canada, and the material associated with those burials, spanning the entire 5,000-year sequence, documents a social and cultural history of extraordinary continuity and complexity. The Tsimshian oral traditions regarding the antiquity of occupation at the harbour are consistent with what the archaeology shows, and in some respects, they suggest a depth of occupation that the archaeology has not fully confirmed, because the earliest levels of occupation are the deepest, most difficult to reach, and least thoroughly excavated. The Tsimshian describe their origins at the harbour in terms that are both genealogical and cosmological, accounting for the beginning of human presence there in ways that connect specific lineages to specific supernatural events. The supernatural register of those accounts is a translation of historical information into a form appropriate for oral preservation, not a replacement of historical information with invention. The genealogical elements, which are documented with considerable specificity in Tsimshian oral tradition, extend back through named lineages across a period that significantly exceeds the documentary history of the region. What the Tsimshian do not describe with the same genealogical specificity is the period before their own lineage origins at the harbour, and yet the archaeological record shows clearly that the harbour was occupied before the earliest Tsimshian lineage accounts begin. Something was there first. Something was using the harbour, burying its dead there, accumulating the kind of dense shell midden deposits that represent many generations of intensive resource use, before the people who identify as Tsimshian ancestors arrived or emerged in their current cultural form. What that something was is a question that the oral traditions address obliquely in accounts of encounters with prior beings, prior peoples, prior presences in the landscape who were there before the current order of things was established, who had their own relationships with the land and the sea, and who were eventually absorbed, displaced, or transformed into something that became part of the Tsimshian world without being exactly the same as the Tsimshian themselves. This kind of layered occupation, in which one cultural tradition succeeds another without complete discontinuity, but also without simple cultural continuity, is common in the archaeological record of the northern coast and is probably common across much of Canada. It is just particularly visible at Prince Rupert Harbour because the site has been studied intensively enough to reveal the layering, the succession of cultural traditions at the harbour, each building on what came before while also changing in significant ways, spans more than 5,000 years of documented occupation. Before that 5,000 years, there are older deposits that have not been fully excavated. And before those deposits, there are the submerged coastal sites of the drowned continental shelf, which no one has fully mapped or systematically surveyed, and which represent the oldest chapter in the story of human occupation on the northern coast. The continental shelf off northern British Columbia and the Alaska Panhandle drops steeply from the modern shoreline, but between Haida Gwaii and the mainland, and along the inside coast of the Alexander Archipelago, there are shallower areas where significant stretches of coastline were dry during lower sea level stands. These areas have been identified by marine geologists as targets for underwater archaeological survey because the conditions that made them habitable during the glacial and early post-glacial periods, the relatively shallow water, the sheltered exposure, the proximity to productive marine and terrestrial resources are the same conditions that make them relatively accessible to divers and remotely operated survey equipment today. The surveys that have been done, still limited in number and geographic scope, have returned results consistent with what the oral traditions have been saying all along. People were there. They were there for a long time, and what they built and where they lived is now underwater. The Chilcotin Nation of the Chilcotin Plateau in central British Columbia preserve a tradition that gets at something even more specific than a general memory of prior occupation. They describe roads, not trails, not paths worn by repeated travel, but constructed routes. Intentional modifications of the landscape that created passages through difficult terrain for purposes that included both practical travel and something the traditions describe as ceremonial or purposeful movement on a larger scale than ordinary subsistence activities would require. These roads, in the Chilcotin account, were not made by the Chilcotin. They were found. They were inherited. They are attributed to people who had specific knowledge of the landscape in its pre-current form, before certain rivers shifted their courses, before certain valleys were blocked by landslides, before the terrain took its present configuration. The roads in the traditions connect places that, in the current landscape, are not obviously worth connecting by a constructed route, because the landscape has changed enough that the logic of the connections is no longer immediately apparent. This is an unusual and specific kind of memory to preserve. General accounts of prior peoples are common across the oral traditions of Canada. Accounts that describe specific infrastructure, specific engineering decisions, specific landscape modifications, whose purpose can be understood only by reference to a landscape that no longer exists in its original form, are much rarer and much more difficult to generate as pure invention. They require either accurate historical memory or an extraordinarily specific form of creative fabrication that would have no obvious purpose or audience within the tradition that preserved it. The simpler explanation is that the memory is accurate and reflects a real prior occupation of the Chilcotin Plateau by people who constructed routes through it for purposes that made sense in the context of the landscape and social organization of their time. The archaeology of the Chilcotin Plateau is less developed than that of the adjacent Fraser Canyon and Interior Plateau, partly because of access difficulties and partly because of the relative scarcity of survey funding. What has been documented includes evidence of human occupation extending back at least 10,000 years, with a sequence of cultural changes that parallels but is not identical to the better documented Interior Plateau sequence. Some features of the archaeological record in the Chilcotin suggest connections to broader cultural patterns across the interior of the continent that remain incompletely understood. The region has not been surveyed intensively enough to rule in or rule out the kinds of landscape modifications that the Chilcotin oral traditions describe, and a targeted survey looking specifically for evidence of constructed routes or intentional landscape modification could produce results that either confirm or refute the oral account. Such a survey has not been done. This gap between what the oral traditions are saying and what the archaeological literature has actually looked for is one of the most significant and most frustrating aspects of the broader picture that this story is trying to draw. Oral traditions are not always correct. They can encode historical errors, mythological additions, and interpretive frameworks that distort the underlying event. But they have also been shown, repeatedly and across cultures, to preserve accurate information about events and landscapes from periods that extend well beyond the normal assumption of reliable oral memory. The systematic comparison of oral traditions with physical evidence, using the traditions as hypotheses to test, rather than as conclusions to accept or reject wholesale, is a methodological approach that is beginning to yield results across the field of archaeology. It has produced the Heiltsuk footprints. It has contributed to the reinterpretation of the Majorville medicine wheel. It is changing the way researchers think about the archaeology of the Pacific Coast. Applied systematically to the full range of Canadian Indigenous oral traditions about prior peoples and prior civilizations, it could produce a very different understanding of the deep human history of this country than the one that currently appears in textbooks. The question of what that prior history actually looked like, the question of what the civilization or civilizations that preceded the current Indigenous peoples of Canada actually were, is one that honest intellectual engagement requires approaching with significant caution. The evidence is real but incomplete. The oral traditions point at something real, but do not describe it in terms that translate directly into a modern archaeological or historical framework. What can be said is this: the standard picture in which the human history of Canada, before approximately 2,000 years ago, is a story of small, mobile, simple hunter-gatherer groups leaving minimal traces in the landscape and developing slowly toward the more complex societies documented by early European contact, is demonstrably inadequate. The traces in the landscape are more numerous, more sophisticated, and more geographically widespread than that picture allows. The oral traditions describing what came before are more specific, more consistent across independent sources, and more archaeologically confirmed than the standard dismissal of those traditions, as mythology would suggest. Something was here. It was more complex than we have acknowledged, and the process of figuring out what it was is, right now, actively underway in laboratories and dive boats and permafrost cores and archive collections across the country, driven by researchers who are willing to take both the physical evidence and the oral traditions seriously as sources of information about a past that deserves better than the silence it has mostly received. There is a forest on the seabed off the coast of British Columbia, not a metaphor. An actual forest, ancient trees still rooted in the sediment that was once their soil, preserved by the cold, dark, anaerobic conditions of the deep water that has covered them for thousands of years. Divers have documented these submerged forests at multiple locations along the BC coast, and the trees they contain are not small. Some are ancient Sitka spruce, western red cedar, hemlock, species that take centuries to reach the sizes seen in the underwater examples. The forests were growing for hundreds of years before the sea claimed them. They are, in a very literal sense, the last physical remnant of a landscape that once supported extensive forest ecosystems and the animals and people who lived in those forests, above what is now open water. The submerged forests are one of the most visually immediate pieces of evidence for the scale of what was lost when the sea rose. Looking at photographs taken by the divers who have documented them, you are looking at a world that was real and inhabited and is now gone. The trees are still there. The stumps and root systems are still there. What is not there anymore is the air above them, the ground beside them, the sky they grew toward, and the people who knew their names and their uses and who walked among them. The rate at which sea levels rose varied across different periods of the post-glacial transition. There were periods of very rapid rise, when melting ice poured enormous volumes of fresh water into the oceans over relatively short periods of time. The most significant of these pulses, from a human perspective, was the event now called Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred approximately 14,600 years ago and raised global sea levels by somewhere between 16 and 25 meters over a period of perhaps 500 years. For coastal peoples, this would have represented a flooding rate of between 3 and 5 centimeters per year, or roughly a meter every 2 to 3 decades. That is fast enough to be observable within a single human lifetime. A person born on a beach might have grandchildren who told their children that their grandparent had described a beach that was now 10 or 15 meters underwater. The oral traditions of coastal peoples across the Pacific Rim, including multiple traditions from the Indigenous peoples of British Columbia, describe flooding events of exactly this character. the waters coming up, the land being covered, the people moving to higher ground, the memory of what was below the water. These accounts are not limited to a single catastrophic flood of the kind described in various religious traditions. They describe a process, a series of risings, a gradual and then sometimes rapid encroachment of the sea over land that had been used and inhabited. They describe the loss not just of land, but of specific places, specific relationships, specific knowledge systems tied to specific landscapes that no longer exist in their original form. The Haida Gwaii kelp forests, which extend along the outer coast of the archipelago and into the waters of Hecate Strait, are among the most productive marine ecosystems on the northern Pacific coast. The kelp supports a food web of extraordinary complexity and richness, from the sea urchins that graze on the holdfasts, to the otters that eat the urchins, to the eagles that hunt the nearshore waters, for the fish that shelter in the kelp canopy. This ecosystem has been here, in something like its current form, for thousands of years, and the peoples who lived alongside it, the Haida and their predecessors in this region, developed relationships with it of extraordinary depth and specificity. The Haida knowledge of the kelp ecosystem, of its seasonal cycles, its productive zones, its indicator species, and its responses to environmental change, is documented in oral traditions that describe the system in terms suggesting thousands of years of careful observation. What the kelp forests also tell us, examined in their current distribution and compared with the bathymetric maps of the submerged shelf, is that the most productive zones of the modern kelp ecosystem correspond to areas that were dry land or very shallow water during the glacial period. The outer coast of Haida Gwaii, now deeply indented by channels and exposed to the full fetch of the North Pacific, was during the glacial period a more protected coast, backed by the exposed continental shelf that extended westward into what is now deep ocean. As the shelf flooded, the shape of the coastline changed dramatically, and with it the character of the nearshore ecosystem. The people who had organized their lives around the pre-flooding coastal geography had to adapt to a new coastline, a new set of marine productivity patterns, a new relationship with the sea. The adaptations they made are visible in the archaeological record as a series of cultural changes in the artifacts and settlement patterns of the BC coast over the period from 14,000 to 5,000 years ago. The changes are not discontinuities. They do not represent a new population moving in. They represent an existing population adjusting to a changing world, developing new technologies and new organizational forms to exploit a new coastal geography. The clam gardens that are a feature of the archaeological record of the BC coast from about 3,500 years ago onward, stone-walled intertidal terraces that dramatically increase the productivity of clam beds, may represent one such adaptation, a technology developed to enhance food production in a coastal environment whose natural productivity had been reduced by the loss of the broad, shallow, pre-flooding shelf. The clam gardens are themselves evidence of a level of coastal engineering sophistication that challenges simple models of pre-contact Pacific Northwest culture. Building a clam garden requires understanding tidal dynamics, clam biology, stone wall construction, and long-term management principles well enough to create and maintain an artificial habitat that produces measurably higher clam yields than an unmodified beach. These are not casual observations translated into simple actions. They are the results of systematic ecological understanding applied through intentional landscape modification. The peoples who built clam gardens along the BC coast were managing their marine environment with a sophistication that, expressed in different materials and at a different scale, would be recognizable as aquaculture in any part of the modern world. And the clam gardens are not the oldest evidence of this kind of sophisticated coastal management on the BC coast. The fish weirs, stone and wood structures built in rivers and tidal channels to direct and trap migrating fish, are documented archaeologically at sites extending back more than 6,000 years in some locations. The Heltsuk, the Tsimshian, the Haida, and other coastal peoples all maintain oral traditions of fish weir management that describe the weirs, not as recent inventions, but as inherited structures, maintained versions of systems that were in place when their ancestors first came to know the rivers where the weirs stand. Some of the stone components of coastal fish weirs are, in fact, genuinely old. and the oral accounts of their origin attribute them to people who understood the rivers and the fish in ways that were the foundation of everything that came afterward. The Storlo Nation of the Lower Fraser River describe a complex system of fishing locations, fish weir sites, and associated ceremonial and management protocols that they trace back through their lineages to the Transformer period, the time when the world was shaped into its current form. The specific fishing locations along the Fraser, the rapids and the rocks, and the channels that concentrate and direct the salmon during their upriver migrations are named and described in Store, low oral tradition, with the kind of precise local knowledge that comes from thousands of years of careful attention. Each named location has a history, a set of associated stories, a protocol for use, a designated family or lineage with primary responsibility for its management. The system in its totality represents a comprehensive management framework for one of the most complex and productive fisheries in North America, a framework that operated without written records for a span of time that the Store, Low themselves do not definitively bound because it extends beyond the reach of genealogical memory. What the Store oral tradition makes clear, and what the archaeological evidence at some key Fraser River sites supports, is that this management system is old. Not old in the sense of being a few hundred years old in the sense of representing an institutional knowledge that has been accumulating and refining itself for thousands of years, anchored to specific physical locations that have been in use for the entire span of that accumulation. The Storlo are currently working with archaeologists and geographers to document and analyze this system in its full complexity, and the results of that work are beginning to reveal an organizational sophistication that is genuinely comparable to what would be called a management civilization in any other part of the world. The boreal peat bogs of Canada are an archive that has barely been opened. Peat forms in waterlogged conditions where organic material accumulates faster than it decomposes, and the Canadian Boreal is home to some of the largest and deepest peat deposits on Earth. These deposits preserve an extraordinary record of past environments, of plant communities and climate conditions and atmospheric composition extending back thousands of years, encoded in the pollen grains and plant fragments and insect remains layered in the peat. They also preserve, in some cases, evidence of human activity in and around the bog systems, charcoal from fires, plant remains that reflect human management of the surrounding vegetation, and in rare cases even human remains themselves, preserved by the acidic, anaerobic conditions of the peat in ways that allow forensic examination of individuals from thousands of years ago. The peat record across the Canadian Boreal, read in conjunction with the oral traditions of the Cree and Dene and Ojibwe peoples, whose territories encompass these landscapes, tells a story of dramatic environmental change over the period since the last glaciation. The early post-glacial period, from roughly 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, was a time of substantial warming across the boreal zone. The tree line advanced northward, lakes grew and then shrank as precipitation patterns shifted, and the landscape that we now think of as the Canadian Boreal Forest was in many periods substantially different from its current form. Grasslands extended further north. Forests extended further south. Lakes that are now shallow were deep and productive. Wetlands that are now extensive were dry enough to support human habitation. The Cree oral traditions describing the time before the current landscape took its shape are consistent with what the peat and lake sediment records show about these environmental changes. The warm time that Cree elders have described to researchers, the time when the land was different and supported different life, is real in the physical record. It happened. The landscape the Cree describe from that time matches the landscape that the paleoecological evidence reconstructs for the early Holocene. And the people the Cree describe as having lived on that landscape, the prior peoples who occupied the warmer land in a time before the current boreal ecosystem was fully established, were people who would have had access to resources and terrain that do not exist in the same form today. The most significant of those resources, in terms of supporting dense and complex human populations, would have been the enormous lakes that existed across the interior of the continent during and immediately after the glacial period. Lake Agassiz, which at its maximum covered an area larger than any current lake in the world, is the most famous of these. But there were others. Lake Ojibwe, which eventually merged with Lake Agassiz to form an even larger combined body of water. Lake McConnell in the Northwest Territories, now divided into Lake Athabasca, Great Slave Lake, and Great Bear Lake. Smaller proglacial lakes in the Peace River country, in the valleys of the Qu'Appelle and Assiniboine rivers, in the lowlands that are now the flat agricultural lands of the Manitoba and Saskatchewan plains. The shores of these lakes would have been among the most productive and hospitable environments in post-glacial Canada, offering fresh water, abundant fish, waterfowl nesting grounds, and access to the grasslands and forests of the surrounding uplands. They would have attracted and supported human populations in significant numbers. The problem is that the lake shores are now either dry and buried under meters of lake sediment, or they are at the bottom of the remnant lakes that replaced the larger post-glacial bodies of water, or they are simply unmarked on the surface of the flat plains and have not been systematically surveyed. The archaeological evidence of occupation around the shores of Lake Agassiz and its contemporaries is not absent, but it is sparse relative to the expected density given the quality of the resource base. And the sparsity almost certainly reflects the difficulty of finding and excavating sites in the flat lake-bottom terrain rather than the actual rarity of occupation. The Cree and Ojibwe and Dakota and Assiniboine oral traditions of the prairie and parkland regions all contain accounts of great water, of a time when the land was under water that has since receded, of human occupation of shores and islands that are now far from any lake. The flood traditions of the Plains peoples are specific enough that researchers have been able to correlate them with the geological record of Lake Agassiz's final stages, when the Great Lake was draining catastrophically through multiple outlets and the landscape was being transformed from an inland sea to a flat sediment plain. The people who were there for that transformation remembered it, and they passed that memory forward in stories that encode both the geographical reality of what happened and the cultural meaning that was made of it. But the flood traditions, across the Indigenous oral record of Canada, also contain a layer that is not simply geographical memory. They describe what was lost when the water came. Not just land, not just hunting grounds and fishing sites. They describe knowledge that was lost, understanding that was washed away or buried, people who held specific kinds of capability that did not survive the transition into the post-flood world. This layer of the flood traditions, read alongside the other accounts of prior peoples and prior civilizations, suggests something that is uncomfortable to state plainly, but that the evidence is pointing toward. The period of dramatic sea level rise and lake drainage that characterized the end of the last ice age, roughly 14,000 to 8,000 years ago, was not just an environmental transition, it was a civilizational rupture. Whatever had been built and organized and understood during the long millennia of glacial period occupation of the coastal shelves and lake shores of North America was largely destroyed by the flooding. Not destroyed in the sense of being deliberately erased, but lost in the ordinary way that things are lost when the land they occupied goes underwater and the people who inhabited them are forced to move to higher ground, to rebuild, to start again with a fraction of what they had before. The traditions of rebuilding, of starting over, of relearning what was known, are present in Indigenous oral accounts across the continent. They are usually read as mythological accounts of cosmic renewal, of the world being remade after destruction. But if you read them as historical accounts of an actual civilizational disruption, they contain information about what was lost and what was recovered and what was never recovered again that is worth taking seriously. What was lost, according to the oral accounts taken together, was substantial. Knowledge of specific places that are now underwater. Knowledge of specific techniques and materials that were tied to those places. Organizational systems that depended on maintaining relationships across a landscape that no longer exists in the form that made those relationships workable. Social structures built around population centers that were drowned. Languages, possibly, that were the primary carriers of accumulated knowledge, and that did not survive the death of the communities that spoke them. What was recovered, or what was rebuilt, or what was preserved in fragments and carried forward by the people who survived the transition, is what we see in the Indigenous cultures of Canada at the time of European contact. Those cultures were not the full expression of what had been developing over the preceding thousands of years of North American human history. They were the survivors, the people who had adapted to the post-flood landscape, who had rebuilt community and knowledge and social organization on the higher ground of the new world that emerged when the water stopped rising. They were sophisticated, they were complex, they were the products of thousands of years of accumulated experience. But they were also carrying the memory of something that had been lost, something larger and older and more elaborately built than anything that had survived, and that memory was in the stories. The stories have been there all along. The problem has not been that the evidence was absent. It has been that the questions being asked of the evidence were too narrow, and the people most qualified to interpret the evidence, the indigenous peoples whose traditions encode the deepest and most continuous relationship with the North American landscape, were systematically excluded from the conversations that shaped the academic understanding of their own history. The residential school system, which operated in Canada from the 1880s through the 1990s, was not only an assault on children and families, it was a deliberate attack on the oral tradition systems that carried the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of North American history. Elders were killed or isolated. Children were beaten for speaking their languages. The transmission of knowledge across generations, which is the mechanism by which oral traditions survive, was interrupted for an entire century across virtually every indigenous nation in the country. The full accounting of what was lost in that century of deliberate cultural destruction is not possible. Some of it can be estimated. Specific traditions that are known to have been held by specific elders who died in residential schools or whose children were taken from them and raised without access to the traditions. Languages that were reduced from full vitality to a handful of elderly speakers in a single generation. Ceremonies that were illegal under Canadian law for 60 years and that went underground or simply stopped. The oral traditions that survived are not the complete oral record of Canada's Indigenous peoples. They are what got through, what people managed to protect and pass on under conditions designed to prevent exactly that. And what got through is already extraordinary in its specificity and its historical depth. Imagine what was not lost. Imagine the full oral record of a civilization that had been accumulating knowledge for 10,000 or 15,000 or 30,000 years. Imagine the astronomical traditions that were still being refined, the ecological knowledge that was still being updated, the genealogical records that extended back through the entire post-glacial period, the accounts of the flooded coastlines and the drowned forests and the great lakes that came and went, the stories about the people who preceded even those stories, who built things that the storytellers had heard about from their own grandparents who had heard about them from grandparents who had actually seen the remnants. Imagine all of that, and then imagine a century-long project designed to erase it. What you are left with, what actually survives, is a miracle of preservation under impossible conditions. It is not everything, but it is enough to point at what it was part of. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Six Nations whose political and social organization became one of the inspirations for the framers of the American Constitution, preserve in their oral traditions accounts of a time before the Confederacy existed, a time when the region of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Valley was occupied by peoples whose organization was different from the Haudenosaunee and who are described as prior to the current order of things. The Haudenosaunee origin accounts are specific about the founding of the Confederacy as a historical event, a political achievement accomplished by specific named individuals in response to a specific political crisis. But they are equally specific about the existence of a world before that founding, a world populated by peoples and beings whose relationship to the current world is one of precedence rather than ancestry. The Longhouse tradition of the Haudenosaunee, the great communal dwelling that housed dozens of related individuals under a single roof, is presented in the oral tradition not as an invention, but as a form that was already understood when the Haudenosaunee began building in it. The specific engineering of the Longhouse, with its barrel vault construction, its central fire and smoke holes, its winter insulation properties, represents an architectural solution to the conditions of the northeastern forest that would have taken considerable time to develop through trial and error. The Haudenosaunee did not claim to have invented it. They claimed to have learned it from traditions and examples that predated their own cultural memory of formal origin. This pattern, repeated in different forms across the country, begins to constitute something recognizable as a systematic feature of Indigenous oral traditions, rather than a set of independent coincidences. Something was built, something was known, something was lost, and the peoples who came after, the peoples who are here now, are the inheritors of what survived from that prior world. the keepers of fragments of a knowledge and a history that is larger than what they hold, and that is, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to be recovered. In 2010, archaeologists using LiDAR technology, light detection and ranging, a method that uses laser pulses to map terrain beneath forest canopy with extraordinary precision, began systematically scanning areas of the Pacific Northwest that had never been adequately surveyed on the ground because of the density of the forest cover. What they found required a recalibration of existing assumptions about the scale and density of pre-contact occupation in the region. Beneath the old-growth forest canopy, the LiDAR imagery revealed features that ground-level survey had missed entirely. Earthworks, linear depressions corresponding to old trails or drainage modifications, mounded areas that turned out on subsequent ground investigation to be the remnants of large storage or processing facilities, and the traces of structures whose size and organization implied populations substantially larger than the standard estimates for the region. The LiDAR surveys of the BC interior and coast are ongoing, and each new survey season tends to produce results that expand rather than contract the picture of pre-contact occupation density. Sites that were considered large and exceptional by earlier standards are turning out to be representative of a much broader pattern of intensive occupation and landscape modification that the forest canopy was concealing. The forest, which, in the standard narrative of pre-contact British Columbia, was the primary resource environment exploited by a dispersed and mobile population, turns out to have been in significant areas a managed landscape, one whose current form reflects not just natural processes, but thousands of years of deliberate human intervention in the ecology of the forest floor, the understory, and the drainage systems. The Secwepemc, the Nlaka'pamux, the Duckle, and other interior plateau peoples all maintain oral traditions of landscape management, of burning practices, of the deliberate cultivation of specific plants, and the maintenance of specific ecological conditions in specific locations. The LiDAR imagery is beginning to show the physical signature of those practices in the landscape at a scale that previous survey methods could not detect. And the scale of what is being revealed is large enough to require a substantive revision of the population estimates that have governed thinking about pre-contact British Columbia for the past century. Population estimates for pre-contact Indigenous North America have been one of the most contested areas of historical scholarship for decades. The figures that were most widely accepted through most of the 20th century, based on early European accounts and early ethnographic studies, were deeply conservative, in some cases resulting from a conscious effort by early American historians to minimize the population displacement that European colonization had caused. More recent estimates, based on carrying capacity calculations, disease impact modeling, and the direct archaeological evidence of settlement density and extent, suggest populations in pre-contact Canada that are 2 to 5 times higher than the conservative figures allowed. For British Columbia specifically, current estimates of pre-contact population have been revised upwards substantially from mid-20th century figures, and the LiDAR evidence suggests that even the more recent, higher estimates may themselves be conservative. What this means for the question of what was lost is significant. A larger pre-contact population implies a larger organizational capacity, a more complex social structure, more extensive trade networks, and a more sophisticated management of resources and territory than the standard narrative accommodates. It implies, in other words, more civilization in the broadest sense of that term, more coordination, more accumulated knowledge, more built environment, more of the things that a prior civilization would have left behind. And if those things are there, in the landscape or on the seafloor, or buried under meters of forest duff, then finding them is a matter of looking in the right places, with the right tools, not a matter of waiting for something that does not exist to materialize. The right tools include not just LiDAR and underwater survey equipment, but also the oral traditions themselves, used as primary sources for where to look. The systematic use of oral traditions as archaeological hypotheses has been one of the most productive methodological developments in North American archaeology over the past 2 decades. It has led to discoveries at sites that were not on the standard survey priority list because the oral tradition made the case for their significance where the standard literature did not. The Hyaltsuk footprints found in 2017 were found because researchers took the Hyaltsuk oral tradition seriously enough to mount an underwater survey in the location it pointed to. That approach, applied systematically across the full body of Canadian Indigenous oral traditions about prior peoples and prior landscape modifications, could produce a generation of discoveries that would fundamentally revise the deep history of this country. The Thule people, the ancestors of modern Inuit, arrived in the Canadian Arctic from Alaska around 1,000 years ago, around the year 1000 of the Common Era. Their expansion eastward across the Arctic was rapid by archaeological standards, covering the entire Canadian Arctic archipelago and reaching Greenland within a few centuries. Their expansion was made possible by a specific set of technological innovations, particularly the development of the umiak, a large open boat capable of carrying an entire family with its goods and hunting equipment, and sophisticated bowhead whale hunting technology that allowed them to exploit an enormous and previously underleveraged food resource. The Thule were extraordinary Arctic adapters, and their rapid spread across the Canadian Arctic represents one of the most impressive feats of environmental colonization in North American prehistory. But the Thule did not arrive in an empty Arctic. They encountered, and eventually absorbed or displaced, the people now known as the Dorset or Tuniat in Inuit oral tradition. The Dorset had occupied the eastern Canadian Arctic and Greenland for approximately 4,000 years before the Thule arrived, and their presence is documented in the archaeological record as far west as the Mackenzie Delta in the Northwest Territories. They were a significant people in their own right, capable of surviving Arctic winters without the dog sled, without the umiak, without the sophisticated composite bow, using a suite of cold weather technologies that are in some respects still not fully understood. The Dorset carved in ivory and antler with a delicacy and artistic skill that has no parallel in Thule material culture, and their spiritual life, documented in their carvings and in traces of ceremonial use at specific sites, was evidently complex and elaborate. The Inuit oral traditions about the Tuniat are among the most consistent and specific accounts of a prior people in the entire Indigenous oral record of Canada. The Tuniat are described as physically larger than the Inuit, extraordinarily strong, capable of carrying boulders that groups of Inuit could not move. They are described as gentle, as easily frightened, as people who ran away when startled rather than fighting back. They are described as living in ways that were different from Inuit ways, but not inferior, as knowledgeable about the Arctic environment in ways that the Inuit recognized as expertise. And they are described as having been driven away, or as having chosen to leave when the Thule arrived, disappearing from the landscape as the Thule moved in, retreating to islands or remote areas where they are sometimes said to have lingered for generations before finally vanishing. The physical evidence broadly supports this oral account. The Dorset archaeological presence ends in most areas of the eastern Canadian Arctic within a few centuries of the documented Thule expansion, though the exact relationship between the two peoples, whether it was primarily competition, disease transmission, cultural absorption, or some combination, remains a subject of active archaeological debate. What is not in debate is that the Dorset were there for 4,000 years before the Thule arrived, and that they built a culture of real sophistication and real beauty, and that almost all of it is gone. The only physical remnant of the Dorset people that persists into the present is their archaeological record and the oral traditions of the people who displaced them. The Inuit descriptions of the Tuniat, repeated across different Inuit communities from Alaska to Greenland, with a consistency that suggests either deep historical memory or very widespread cultural contact, contain something beyond the account of a prior Arctic people. They contain an acknowledgement of loss. The Tuniat are spoken of with a combination of sadness and respect that suggests the Inuit understood, even in the moment of displacement, that what was happening was not simply the replacement of a lesser people by a greater one. The Tuniat knew things. They had lived in this landscape for 4,000 years, and they understood it in ways that the Thule, newcomers, however brilliantly adapted, did not yet understand. And when they left, or were driven out, what they knew went with them, mostly. Mostly because the Thule absorbed some of what the Dorset had developed. Specific hunting techniques, specific site locations, specific knowledge about where to find specific resources at specific times of year. The accumulation of 4,000 years of Arctic ecological knowledge does not disappear entirely with the people who held it if some of that knowledge is transferred, formally or informally, in the interactions between the disappearing people and the incoming one. The Inuit oral traditions contain elements that may represent such transferred knowledge, and identifying those elements is a research project that is just beginning to be pursued systematically. But the deeper question raised by the Thule-Dorset transition is not about knowledge transfer. It is about what the Dorset had built during their 4,000 years in the Arctic, and whether that building constitutes, in some meaningful sense, a civilization that is now lost. The Dorset left behind no monumental architecture comparable to Cahokia or the Keatley Creek pit houses. They left no trade networks comparable to the Hopewell network of the continental interior. What they left behind was carved ivory of extraordinary quality, evidence of sophisticated ceremonial life at specific sites, and 4,000 years of continuous Arctic occupation that no subsequent people has matched in duration. 4,000 years in the harshest human environment on Earth. That is not nothing. That is, by any reasonable measure, a civilization. And the question of what connects that civilization, or the ones on the Pacific coast, or the ones of the interior plateau and the Great Lakes, to the even older occupations that the coastal flooding buried, is the question that is hardest to answer and most important to ask. Because if the flooding of the coastal shelves and the lake draining of the early Holocene did indeed represent a civilizational rupture, a discontinuity that erased or damaged the accumulated achievements of the deepest layers of North American prehistory, then what came after was not the beginning of North American civilization, it was the rebuilding of it. The cultures that European explorers encountered in the 15th and 16th centuries were not primitive peoples in an undeveloped land. They were the survivors of a catastrophe that had destroyed most of what their predecessors had built, and they had been rebuilding for 10,000 years from the fragments of what remained. This reframing of indigenous North American history is not a comfortable one for the standard narrative of European contact and colonization. If the peoples encountered by European explorers were not at the beginning of a civilizational development trajectory, but at a specific point in a recovery from a previous civilizational disruption, then the nature of what colonization destroyed is different from what the standard narrative suggests. It was not just a set of cultures at a relatively early stage of development, it was a set of cultures at an advanced stage of recovery from a deep historical trauma, carrying within their oral traditions the memory of something much larger and older than anything visible on the current landscape, and engaged in the long project of rebuilding towards something that had once existed and might have existed again if the second disruption had not arrived. What happened at approximately 1100 to 1200 CE, in the century or so before European contact began to become a significant factor in the northern reaches of the continent, is one of the most poorly understood and most significant periods in North American prehistory. The archaeological record across an enormous geographic area shows signs of dramatic reorganization during this period. Large settlements that had been continuously occupied for centuries were abandoned. Trade networks that had connected peoples across thousands of kilometers contracted or collapsed. Agricultural communities in the northern limits of maize cultivation retreated southward. The Mississippian culture, which had reached its peak in the century around 1100 CE, began a long decline that would result in the largely empty landscape that European explorers described along the middle Mississippi Valley 2 centuries later. The causes of this reorganization are debated. Drought, identified in the tree ring record, is clearly implicated in some areas. Social conflict, identifiable in the archaeological record through the evidence of violence at specific sites, played a role in others. Climate change, in the form of the centuries-long cooling, now called the Little Ice Age, reduced agricultural productivity across a wide band of the northern continent and may have destabilized populations that had grown to levels that a cooler climate could not support. The specific mechanisms varied by region, but the overall pattern of contraction and reorganization across a broad geographic area in a relatively short period is real, and its effects on the oral traditions of the peoples involved are significant. What was lost in that period of reorganization in the 12th and 13th centuries was added to what had already been lost in the flooding of the early Holocene, added to what was lost in the disruptions of the preceding millennia, added to what was lost in the civilizational rupture of the Ice Age transition. The oral traditions of Canada's Indigenous peoples were carrying all of those layers of loss simultaneously, preserving what could be preserved, encoding what could be encoded, maintaining continuity across disruptions that would have destroyed less robust transmission systems. And then came European contact, and the residential schools, and the deliberate project of cultural erasure, and the traditions that had survived everything else, faced a new and explicitly designed threat. The fact that enough survived to tell any of this story at all is significant. The fact that what survived is as specific and as archaeologically consistent as it turns out to be is more than real. It is evidence of the extraordinary care with which those traditions were maintained, and of the extraordinary importance that the peoples who held them placed on keeping them intact. They knew what was in those stories. They knew that what was in those stories was more than mythology. They kept the stories because the stories were true, in the deepest sense that matters, which is not the sense of literal factual accuracy about specific events, but the sense of preserving real information about real things that happen to real people in real places that can, if you know how to look, be found. The underwater survey off Calver Island found the footprints because researchers took the Hailtsuk oral tradition seriously enough to look where it pointed. That is the method. That is the path forward for recovering the deep history of Canada that the standard narrative has been missing, not replacing oral tradition with archaeology, not replacing archaeology with oral tradition, using each to ask questions of the other, in the knowledge that both are incomplete and both are essential, and that the full picture is larger than either can contain alone. The people who pressed their feet into the mud of Calvert Island 14,000 years ago were real people. They had names, in whatever language they spoke. They had families and stories and knowledge of that coastline that no one alive today has. The people who told stories about the flooding of that coastline, and who passed those stories forward through 230 generations to the people who told them to the researchers who went looking for the footprints, were real people too, engaged in a project of historical preservation that deserves the same respect we give to any other archive. The archive is still being read. The reading has barely begun. And what is being found every year in the sediment and the oral record and the LiDAR maps and the underwater surveys is consistently pointing toward the same conclusion. Something was here. It was old. It was complex. Most of it is gone. And the people who remember it, imperfectly but truly, are the ones who have been here all along, saying so, waiting for someone to listen. There is a site in Manitoba, in the Whiteshell Provincial Park east of Winnipeg, that most Canadians have never heard of. It does not appear prominently in national histories or in the standard curriculum of Canadian schools. It does not receive the same tourist attention as Stonehenge or the Nazca Lines or the megalithic temples of Malta, but what it represents is at least as significant as any of those more famous sites, and the silence around it is itself a telling piece of evidence about the way Canadian history has been framed and who has been included in the framing. The site is known among the Anishinaabe as Tai Creek, or by its ceremonial designation, which referring to a place of teaching and power associated with the figure Nanabojo, the trickster transformer at the center of Anishinaabe oral tradition. Spread across the exposed bedrock of the Precambrian Shield, there are hundreds of stone figures, configurations of fist-sized rocks arranged in forms ranging from simple circles to complex arrangements that include representations of animals, human figures, and abstract patterns that archaeologists classify as petroforms. The largest arrangements cover substantial areas of bedrock. Some of the circles and other configurations have been shown through systematic measurement to align with celestial events, solstice sunrises, equinox sunsets, and the rising of specific stars that feature in Anishinaabe astronomical traditions. The age of the whiteshell petroforms is difficult to establish with precision because the stones sit on bedrock with no associated organic material that can be directly dated. Indirect dating methods, based on the weathering of the rock surfaces and the growth of lichens on the stone arrangements, suggest construction dates ranging from several centuries to several thousand years ago. The Anishinaabe do not regard the question of age as particularly informative. The petroforms have been there since before Anishinaabe memory of them begins, which is to say, they were there when the Anishinaabe arrived in this territory, placed there by people who were using the shield for ceremonial and astronomical purposes before the Anishinaabe were present to observe them. The astronomical alignments at the Whiteshell site are real in the sense of being measurable and reproducible. The arrangement of the major configurations, when analyzed against the positions of celestial objects at different points in time, suggests that the site was calibrated with reference to a specific astronomical moment, and the calculation of which moment fits the observed alignments places the original calibration at a period somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 years ago. This is a period during which the territory now occupied by Anishinaabe peoples may or may not have been Anishinaabe territory in the sense in which we now understand that term. The Anishinaabe themselves describe a history of movement and expansion across the Great Lakes region, and the periods of that movement are not precisely established. The possibility that the white shell petroforms were built by a pre-Anishinaabe population whose relationship to the Anishinaabe is not one of simple cultural continuity is real and acknowledged in some Anishinaabe oral accounts. What those accounts say about the builders is consistent with what we have been hearing from other traditions across the country. They were here before, they knew things. They worked in stone in ways that reflected a sophisticated understanding of the sky and of the relationship between celestial patterns and the ordering of human life on the landscape below. They left marks. The marks are still there. Their identity has become blurred by the passage of time, but their presence and their knowledge are not in question within the tradition that preserved the awareness of them. The Cree peoples of the boreal forest and subarctic, whose territory extends from James Bay in the east to the foothills of the Rockies in the west, preserve astronomical traditions of considerable sophistication. The Cree name for the Milky Way, sometimes translated as the Path of Souls, encodes an understanding of the galaxy's structure and of its relationship to the changing seasons that reflects extended and careful observation. Specific stars and star groups are named in Cree tradition and associated with specific seasons, specific animal behaviors, specific ecological conditions that serve as practical guides to living well on the land. The star knowledge is not ornamental. It is functional, a calendar and a navigational system and an ecological monitoring framework, all encoded in a set of names and stories that can be taught to children young enough to learn everything they need to know about it before they need to use it. The Cree astronomical tradition, like the Blackfoot tradition and the Anishinaabe tradition, is described by those who hold it not as something the Cree invented, but as something the Cree received. The star knowledge came from somewhere and someone before it became Cree knowledge. The oral accounts of that transmission are variable in their specifics, but they share the common feature of describing the original source as beings or people who had a deeper or more comprehensive relationship with the sky than the Cree themselves have, people who understood celestial patterns in ways that the Cree have preserved imperfectly because they received only part of what there was to know. This sense of partial inheritance, of possessing a fragment of something once more complete, is one of the most consistent and most poignant features of the Indigenous oral traditions of Canada when examined in aggregate. The traditions do not describe themselves as self-originating complete systems. They describe themselves as survivals, as what got through, as the portion of a larger inheritance that has been preserved through periods of disruption and loss. This is a rare and important quality in an oral tradition. Most oral traditions present themselves as authoritative and complete, as the full account of the group's history and knowledge. The consistent acknowledgement across multiple independent traditions that what is held is partial, that something more complete once existed and is now not accessible, is an indication that the traditions are reporting accurately about their own history rather than constructing a mythology of completeness. The stone pipe tradition of the Nehiyaw, the Plains Cree, is another example of this pattern of partial inheritance. Ceremonial stone pipes of extraordinary craft appear in the archaeological record of the Northern Plains at ages extending back thousands of years, in contexts associated with trade and ceremony across enormous distances. The Nehiyaw oral tradition regarding pipe making and pipe use is specific about the sacredness and the antiquity of the practice, and it is equally specific about the fact that the deepest knowledge of stone pipe making, the knowledge of which stones to use, how to work them, what they mean, and what they are for, came from people who understood stone in ways that the Nehiyaw received only partially. The full teaching was not transmitted. What was transmitted is what is held. What was not transmitted is acknowledged as a gap, a loss. something that existed once and is no longer accessible. The archaeological distribution of certain stone pipe types across the northern plains and the boreal fringe is one of the clearest material signatures of a pre-contact trade and exchange network of impressive geographic reach. Pipes made from specific stone types that originate in quarries in Manitoba or Saskatchewan or the Dakotas have been found in burial and ceremonial contexts across an area spanning thousands of kilometers. The movement of these objects across the landscape implies not just long-distance trade, but sustained relationships between widely separated communities, shared ceremonial protocols that made the objects meaningful in the receiving communities as well as the producing ones, and a degree of cultural integration across a vast area that challenges simple models of pre-contact North America as a collection of small, isolated, locally focused communities. The Hopewell interaction sphere, as archaeologists call the network of exchange and shared ceremonial practice that connected communities across the eastern half of North America from roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, is the most intensively studied example of this kind of large-scale pre-contact connectivity, but it was not unique. Earlier networks, less thoroughly documented because their evidence is less visible in the standard archaeological record, existed across the continent in different periods. The Old Copper Complex, with its distribution of cold-hammered copper objects across enormous distances, is one example. The movement of specific types of obsidian, a volcanic glass found in specific geological source areas and identifiable by geochemical analysis to those specific sources, documents exchange networks extending from Yellowstone to the Great Lakes and from the Pacific coast to the Rocky Mountain front, long before the Hopewell period. People were in contact across enormous distances, and what they were exchanging was not just material goods but knowledge, ceremony, and social obligation. The implications of this connectivity for the question of prior civilizations in Canada are significant. A prior civilization that left no monumental architecture visible from the surface might nonetheless be detectable in the material and organizational evidence it produced, if that evidence was distributed across a wide enough network, and if enough of it survived in the archaeological record. The challenge is that the evidence is distributed, and the distribution has not been systematically analyzed from the perspective of what it tells us about prior organizational forms, rather than about the specific cultural traditions in which it was found. The Rupert's Land region of northern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario, the vast boreal territory draining into Hudson Bay via the Nelson and Hayes rivers, contains one of the least archaeologically surveyed areas of comparable size in the world. The few systematic surveys that have been done have produced results that consistently exceed expectations, finding evidence of human occupation and activity at densities and in forms that the standard models for the region did not predict. The Mushkegowuk Cree, whose territory encompasses much of this region, have been describing the archaeological richness of their land to researchers for generations. They know where the old occupation sites are. They know which rivers and which lake shores and which eskers have evidence of extensive prior use. They have been willing to share this knowledge with researchers who asked appropriately and who were willing to work within Mushkegowuk protocols for accessing information about the land. The surveys done in partnership with Mushkegowuk communities have consistently found what the community members indicated would be found. The largest unexcavated portion of Canadian pre-contact history, measured by the ratio of known sites to sites that have been systematically studied, is almost certainly in the Boreal Shield and subarctic, the vast territory between the agricultural south and the Arctic that is often treated in overview histories as a region of sparse and simple occupation. The evidence does not support this characterization. The evidence supports a much more complex picture of dense and sustained occupation, of trade and exchange networks connecting boreal communities to the larger cultural formations to the south and west, of landscape knowledge and management practices of considerable sophistication, and of oral traditions that describe all of this with a specificity and a consistency that demands serious attention. The Beothuk of Newfoundland represent one of the most tragic and most instructive cases in the entire Canadian story. The Beothuk, the people of the island of Newfoundland, were the first Indigenous people of the Americas encountered by John Cabot in 1497, and they were the first to be driven to extinction by European colonization in the northern half of the continent. With the death of the last known Beothuk, a woman named Shenordithit, in 1829, in those 332 years, an entire people and everything they knew was erased. Not slowly or ambiguously, deliberately and thoroughly. What made the Beothuk particularly significant for the questions this story is addressing is that they occupied an island that had been inhabited for approximately 8,000 years before European contact, and that the sequence of peoples who inhabited Newfoundland over those 8,000 years is one of the most complex and least understood in North American archaeology. The earliest occupation, by what archaeologists call the maritime archaic tradition, extended from approximately 8,000 years ago to around 3,500 years ago, and it produced a material culture of real sophistication, including elaborate burial practices with extensive use of red ochre, long-distance trade in specific stone types, and bone tools whose manufacturing implies knowledge of animal anatomy comparable to what ethnographers have documented in later hunter-gatherer societies. The maritime archaic people were not simple. They were complex, knowledgeable, and evidently capable of sustaining a way of life of considerable richness for thousands of years on an island that is not an easy environment to inhabit. The maritime archaic were followed by the Dorset, and the Dorset were followed by the Beothuk, and the Beothuk were followed by oblivion. Each transition involved the loss of accumulated knowledge that the succeeding people either did not receive or received only in fragments. Each transition added another layer of forgetting to a history that was already ancient. And then the Europeans arrived, and the last people who held any of that layered knowledge were driven to extinction in 3 centuries. Shenardithit, who lived with English colonizers for the last 5 years of her life, and who died of tuberculosis at around 23 years of age, communicated what she could of Beothuk culture and history through drawings and through the limited shared language she and her hosts developed. What she was able to communicate was a fraction of what she knew, and what she knew was a fraction of what the Beothuk as a people had preserved. And what the Beothuk had preserved was a fraction of the layered inheritance of 8,000 years of occupation of their island. The drawings Shenordithit made, preserved in the Beothuk collection at the Nova Scotia Museum of Natural History, are extraordinary documents of a world that is entirely gone. They show ceremonial objects, social arrangements, subsistence practices, and landscape features in forms that suggest a culture of real depth and specificity. They also show, in what they do not contain, the enormous scale of what was lost before Shenordithit ever put pencil to paper. The Norse contact with the peoples of northeastern North America, documented archaeologically at Lansaw Meadows in Newfoundland and referenced in the Vinland sagas, took place around the year 1000 CE. The Norse called the people they encountered Skraelings, a contemptuous term whose exact meaning is debated, but whose dismissive intent is clear. The Vinland sagas describe contacts with 2 distinct groups, one of whom lived in the area around Lansaw Meadows, and one of whom the Norse encountered further south during their brief exploratory voyages. The material evidence at Lansaw Meadows confirms Norse occupation of the site for a period of a few years around 1000 CE and then abandonment, probably related to the difficulty of maintaining a settlement in a region where the local peoples were not welcoming and where the Norse lacked the numbers to establish a secure position. What the Vinland sagas do not provide is a perspective from the other side of the encounter. The people the Norse met did not write sagas. They had oral traditions that may have preserved some memory of the contact, but those traditions are difficult to identify with confidence because the Norse presence was brief, limited in geographic scope, and ended before it could make the kind of sustained cultural impact that would be reliably preserved across 1,000 years of oral transmission. Some researchers have identified possible references to the Norse in the oral traditions of Algonquian peoples from the Maritimes and Newfoundland area, but the identifications are uncertain and the oral evidence is fragmentary. What is not fragmentary is the archaeological evidence at Lansaw Meadows itself. The Norse left behind a set of structures whose excavation in the 1960s by Helge and Anstein Ingstad constituted one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history. But the Norse structures are not the oldest features at the site. The evidence of indigenous occupation at the same location predates the Norse settlement substantially, and the landscape around Lansaw Meadows bears the marks of long and intensive use by the maritime archaic, and then the Dorset peoples, who preceded the Norse by thousands of years. The Norse chose their settlement location. In other words, in a place that had already been used by indigenous peoples for millennia, a place that the landscape itself indicated as a significant and productive location. The Beothuk, who were in Newfoundland when Europeans arrived in the late 15th century, were not the only indigenous people with a claim to having been there before. They were the survivors, the most recent inhabitants of an island that had supported human life continuously for 8,000 years. And in those 8,000 years, the accumulated weight of everything that had been learned and built and organized and lost in that place was so enormous that even its fragments were worth more than anything the European arrivals brought, with them in the form of understanding about how to live in that particular landscape. The Beothuk knew where the caribou crossed. They knew the seasonal movements of the marine mammals. They knew the medicinal plants of the boreal forest and the productive stretches of river and the safe harbours along a coast that is genuinely dangerous to navigate in the weather that Newfoundland can produce. They knew all of this because people before them had learned it and passed it forward through all the transitions and disruptions of 8,000 years of island life. And all of it is gone, not inaccessible, not buried waiting to be found, but gone. Shanordithit was the last. What she carried died with her. The drawings she made are evidence that something existed. They do not restore it. They are the shadow on the wall where the fire used to be. This is the irreversible dimension of the story this essay has been telling, the dimension that distinguishes it from a purely archaeological or historical narrative. The deep human history of Canada that is being recovered through the combination of oral traditions and physical evidence is not being fully recovered. It is being partially recovered. The portions of it that survive in oral traditions are accessible to the extent that the communities holding those traditions are willing and able to share them. The portions of it that survive in the physical record are accessible to the extent that the physical record has not been destroyed and has been or will be found. What exists in neither the oral record nor the physical record is simply gone, as completely and as finally as Shanordithit herself. The scale of that loss is not quantifiable in any useful way. You cannot measure the specific gravity of knowledge that no longer exists. You cannot weigh what was understood about the sky and the stars and the seasonal movements of animals by people who observed them for 15,000 years and then died without descendants who continued the observation in the same form. You cannot excavate what was understood about the drowned coastlines by people who walked on them and who are themselves now gone along with the coastlines they knew. The loss is real, and it is total, and it cannot be recovered. What can be recovered is something. Not everything, but something. And the something that can be recovered is worth the effort and the rigor and the humility required to recover it. The oral traditions of the surviving peoples are part of that something. The physical evidence in the landscape and on the seafloor is part of it. The genetic evidence in the genomes of living people is part of it. The LiDAR imagery of forested landscapes is part of it. The pollen records in the peat bogs are part of it. Put together, these sources are beginning to tell a story that is more complex and more ancient and more impressive than anything that was visible from the surface of the standard narrative. When archaeologists speak of the silence of the record, they mean the absence of evidence that should, by all accounts of what we know about how human beings behave, be present. Humans build things. They modify their environments. They leave traces that endure in stone and shell and charcoal and bone. When a region shows evidence of long occupation, but the density of that evidence is far below what would be expected given the quality of the resource base and the known capacity of the peoples involved, the reasonable inference is not that the occupation was sparse. The reasonable inference is that the evidence is not where we have been looking for it, or that conditions have destroyed evidence that once existed, or both. Both of those explanations apply with particular force to the coastal regions of Canada. The evidence is not where we have been looking, because we have been looking on the current land surface, while the oldest and densest evidence is on the drowned continental shelf. And conditions have destroyed evidence, because the flooding of that shelf and the subsequent reworking of the seafloor by currents and sediment transport and biological activity has damaged or destroyed significant portions of whatever was on those former land surfaces. What survives underwater is whatever was covered quickly enough by sediment to be protected from the destructive processes of the open seafloor, and whatever is in locations sheltered enough from current activity to have remained intact. Given what the 2017 Calvert Island survey found in exactly such a sheltered location, the inference that more remains to be found in similar locations is not speculation. It is the prediction that the available evidence demands. The technological capacity to find it now exists. Remotely operated vehicles equipped with sub-bottom profiling sonar can identify buried features on the seafloor in much the same way that ground-penetrating radar can identify buried features on land. Sediment core sampling from areas indicated by sub-bottom profiling can extract datable organic material from buried surfaces. Dive-based excavation can retrieve and document material from specific promising locations. The technology exists. The funding and the prioritization of these methods for the specific purpose of finding evidence of pre-contact human occupation on the Canadian continental shelf is what has not existed at the necessary scale. That is beginning to change, driven by a combination of factors. The accumulating physical evidence that confirms what the oral traditions have been saying. The methodological recognition that oral traditions are valid sources of archaeological hypotheses. The political and legal recognition of Indigenous rights to their territories, which creates both the imperative and the institutional structure for collaborative research that includes Indigenous knowledge as a primary input rather than an afterthought. And the sheer weight of accumulated scholarly work pointing toward the inadequacy of the standard narrative, coming from enough independent directions that the standard narrative is no longer capable of accommodating all of it without fracturing. The fractures are showing in the academic literature. Papers published in the last decade in the journals of physical anthropology, paleoclimate science, marine geology, and archaeology have individually challenged specific elements of the standard story, and the challenges are cumulative. The footprints at Calvert Island, the astronomical alignments at Majorville and Moose Mountain, the LiDAR evidence of dense pre-contact settlement across the BC interior, the genetic evidence of multiple distinct population inputs into the ancestry of the current Indigenous peoples of Canada, the isotopic evidence of long-distance trade in marine materials deep into the interior and of boreal materials appearing in coastal contexts, indicating exchange patterns whose complexity implies organizational systems capable of managing trade across thousands of kilometers. Each of these findings individually is manageable within a revised but not fundamentally altered standard narrative. Together, they are pointing at something substantially different from any version of the standard narrative that has yet been articulated. What that something is can be approached by asking a different question than the one that archaeology usually asks of pre-contact North America. The usual question is, what can we find? The better question is, given what we know about how human beings behave, and given what we know about the quality of the environments available in Canada over the post-glacial period, and given what we know about the depth and antiquity of human occupation of this continent, what should we expect to find? And the answer to that question is considerably more than the standard narrative has been describing. Human beings, given favorable environmental conditions and sufficient time, build complex social organizations. They develop specialized knowledge. They create institutional structures for passing that knowledge across generations. They engage in long-distance exchange. They modify their environments in ways that increase productivity and stability. They develop sophisticated understanding of the astronomical and ecological patterns that govern the conditions of their lives. These are not advanced behaviors exclusive to the cultures that historians have called civilizations. They are universal human behaviors present in every group that has been studied with sufficient care. The question is not whether the peoples of pre-contact Canada engaged in these behaviors. The question is, at what scale and with what sophistication? And the answer to that question depends on the quality and the duration of the conditions available to them. The conditions available to the peoples of the Pacific coast of Canada over the past 15,000 years were, by any objective assessment, excellent. The marine productivity of the BC coast is among the highest on Earth, driven by the upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich Pacific water along the continental slope and by the exceptional biological productivity of the kelp forest ecosystems. The terrestrial ecosystems of the coastal rainforest are similarly productive, with large game animals, abundant plant foods, and resources of wood, stone, and fiber available in profusion. The climate, moderated by the Pacific Ocean, is mild by Canadian standards. The navigability of the coast, with its protected inside passages and its network of islands and inlets, allowed movement and communication over long distances without exposure to the open ocean. 15,000 years in conditions of this quality, with a population that demonstrably had the cognitive capacity to develop sophisticated technological and social systems, should produce something. It should produce something visible in the archaeological record, and it should produce something audible in the oral traditions. Both things are true. The archaeological record, impoverished by the flooding but not entirely emptied by it, shows evidence of long-term occupation, landscape management, and social complexity at a scale that the standard narrative has systematically underestimated. The oral traditions describe, consistently and across independent sources, a world that was here before the current world, built by people who came before the current peoples, and lost in a series of disruptions whose combined effect has been to produce the historically and archaeologically underdeveloped portrait of pre-contact Canada that appears in the textbooks. The oral traditions are not simply supplementary to the physical evidence. In many cases, they are ahead of it, pointing at things that the physical evidence has not yet caught up with, describing features of the pre-contact landscape and its occupation that archaeology is only beginning to confirm. This predictive quality, the ability of the oral traditions to direct researchers to things that turn out to be real, is one of the strongest arguments for taking them seriously as historical sources. A tradition that invents its history does not reliably predict the findings of future physical surveys. A tradition that preserves its history does. The systematic program of research that would be required to recover even a significant fraction of what the oral traditions and the physical evidence together suggest existed would take generations. It would require deep collaboration between the communities whose oral traditions provide the primary hypotheses, the archaeologists and geologists and climatologists, and geneticists whose methods can test those hypotheses, and the governments and institutions whose funding and logistical support are necessary for work at the required scale and geographic range. Such a program does not currently exist, though elements of it are in place at various locations and the momentum toward it is building. In the meantime, what is already known is enough to support a provisional understanding of what the deeper human history of Canada looks like, one that is substantially different from the standard narrative and substantially closer to what the oral traditions have been describing. It looks like this. The continent now known as Canada was first occupied by human populations during or before the last glacial maximum along the Pacific coast through the ice-free refugia of the continental shelf, and possibly through other routes whose evidence is less well preserved. Those initial populations were not simple or sparse. They were organized enough to cross significant stretches of open water and to establish themselves in environments whose productivity they were able to assess and exploit at a high level. Over the period from 14,000 to 8,000 years ago, those populations expanded across the continent as the ice retreated and new environments became available, adapting their social and technological systems to the conditions of each new region they entered, and maintaining connections across enormous distances through exchange networks of impressive geographic reach. During this period, the most productive and most densely occupied regions were the coastal lowlands that are now underwater, and the shores of the great post-glacial lakes that have since drained or substantially contracted. The populations in those regions developed social and organizational systems appropriate to the density and stability of the resource bases they were exploiting, systems that were more complex and more institutionally elaborate than anything that developed in the less productive inland environments. They developed the astronomical and ecological knowledge systems that their successors would preserve in oral tradition. They built the physical infrastructure, the fish weirs and the clam gardens and the constructed routes and possibly the larger earthworks and stone arrangements that their successors would inherit and maintain. The flooding of the coastal shelves and the draining of the great interior lakes, which played out over roughly 4,000 years, from 8,000 to 4,000 years before the present, disrupted these populations in ways that had permanent effects on the trajectory of social development in the affected regions. Communities that had been organized around specific coastal or lakeshore locations were forced to relocate. Resource bases that had supported dense populations shrank or disappeared. Trade networks that had connected widely separated communities lost some of their key nodes. The social and organizational systems that had been built around the conditions of the pre-flooding world were not fully transferable to the changed conditions of the post-flooding world. What survived was not nothing. The peoples who moved to higher ground carried their knowledge with them, or as much of it as could survive the disruption. They rebuilt, over the subsequent thousands of years, social and organizational forms appropriate to the new landscape. The cultures that Europeans encountered in the 15th and 16th centuries were the products of that rebuilding, and they were impressive. But they were also the products of disruption, of loss, of rebuilding from fragments rather than building from a full inheritance. The oral traditions carry the memory of what was lost as well as the record of what was preserved. And the memory of loss is part of the living knowledge of these traditions, not a separate layer added by retrospective sentimentality. The specific question that this story set out to address, whether Canada's first peoples spoke of a civilization older than their own that has never been found, deserves a specific answer. The answer is, yes, they did, and it has not been fully found, and the reasons why it has not been fully found are not mysterious. Most of it is underwater, or under permafrost, or in landscapes that have not been surveyed with the right tools, or in oral traditions that have not been treated as the serious historical sources they are. The project of finding what remains findable is underway. The project of acknowledging what is not findable and building an appropriate understanding of what was lost is also necessary, and it is harder because it requires sitting with the knowledge that the story is incomplete in ways that cannot be completed, and that the incompleteness is itself the result of choices that were made by people, not by time. The oral traditions do not resolve the incompleteness. They are not a full account of what the prior civilization or civilizations built or knew or meant. They are what got through. They are the voices of people who understood that they were holding fragments of something larger, who treated those fragments with extraordinary care across extraordinary spans of time, and who are still here, still holding them, still willing to share them with people who approach with the right kind of attention and the right kind of respect. Sitting with the full body of these traditions, across all the nations and all the regions of this country, what you hear is something that has no single name and no simple characterization. It is a sound that is both very old and very present. It is the sound of people who have been saying for a very long time that they remember more than the history books have given them credit for remembering. It is the sound of a record that was kept against enormous odds and that is still being kept in languages that are fighting for their lives against the same forces that have been trying to erase them for 500 years. It is also the sound of something that is being heard, at last, in a way it has not been heard before. The researchers who are listening, and who are bringing to that listening the full force of modern scientific methods applied in collaboration with the communities whose knowledge they are trying to understand, are finding what the traditions have been pointing at. It is not everything, it will never be everything, but it is real, and it is substantial, and it is changing the story. The story that is changing is the story of Canada, and the story of the continent, and the story of what it means to be a human being who has been on this land long enough to have seen it change, shape, and flood, and freeze, and thaw, and regenerate. The people who have been here that long are still here. What they know is still worth knowing, and the civilization or civilizations that preceded them, that built things and knew things, and left marks in the landscape that are still there to be found, deserves to be found, to the extent that finding is still possible. The seafloor remembers what the land has forgotten. The peat bog remembers what the forest has replaced. The oral tradition remembers what the archive has not recorded. These are not lesser forms of memory than the written record that historians have traditionally privileged. They are different forms of memory, with different strengths and different vulnerabilities, and the full story of Canada's deep human past requires all of them together, read with the care and the rigour and the humility that the subject demands. What was here was old. What was here was more than the textbooks have said, and the people who remember it are the ones who have been here all along. There is a serpent on a hill above Rice Lake in Ontario. It has been there long enough that the Mississauga Anishinaabe, who have lived in the region for centuries, refer to it as a feature of the landscape that was already ancient when their own presence began. It is an effigy mound, a raised earthwork in the form of a serpent more than 60 meters long, built on a high ridge overlooking the lake and oriented in a direction that archaeological analysis has suggested corresponds to astronomical alignments with specific celestial events. The Ontario Serpent Mound is the only effigy mound in Canada, and it is associated in the archaeological literature with the Point Peninsula complex, a cultural tradition of the Middle Woodland period that flourished in southern Ontario from roughly 2,000 to 1,000 years ago, and that maintained trade and ceremonial connections with the larger Hopewell network centered in Ohio. The Hopewell interaction sphere, at its peak from roughly 2,100 to 1,500 years ago, was one of the most extensive and sophisticated networks of exchange and shared ceremonial practice in the pre-contact Americas. It moved objects from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, and it distributed not just physical goods, but symbolic systems, ceremonial protocols, and architectural conventions across an area of several million square kilometers. The earthwork complexes of Ohio and Illinois that are the most visible physical expression of Hopewell culture are monuments of genuine grandeur. Geometric enclosures covering hundreds of hectares, earthen mounds that in some cases exceed the Great Pyramid of Giza in volume, precisely engineered to align with celestial events with a degree of accuracy that required both sophisticated astronomical knowledge and sophisticated engineering skill. The connection between these Ohio monuments and the Canadian context is not just the Serpent Mound at Rice Lake. It extends through the entire Point Peninsula complex and its successor traditions into the early Iroquoian cultures that would eventually produce the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Iroquoian peoples of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Valley are archaeologically documented as sharing in the broader Hopewell ceremonial complex during the Middle Woodland period, receiving materials and participating in exchange networks that connected them to communities hundreds of kilometers distant. The Hopewell connection brought to the Iroquoian ancestors not just objects but ideas, and some of those ideas survived the collapse of the Hopewell network itself. The collapse of the Hopewell interaction sphere around 1,500 years ago is one of the great unresolved problems of North American archaeology. The network had been sustaining itself for roughly 600 years when, over a relatively short period, the exchange flows that had connected communities across the continent contracted dramatically. The Ohio earthwork complexes, which had required coordinated labor from large populations, were no longer built or maintained. The exotic materials that had traveled enormous distances through the Hopewell networks stopped moving. Communities that had participated in the wider exchange system seemed to have turned inward, reorganizing around local resources and local social structures in ways that produced more regionally distinct and less mutually connected cultural traditions. The causes are debated: climate change, social conflict, resource depletion, epidemic disease, political reorganization at the centers of the network. All of these have been proposed, and all of them may have contributed in different degrees in different regions. What is clear is that the collapse of the Hopewell network represented a significant reduction in the geographic scope of social organization across eastern North America, a contraction from a system that had operated at a continental scale to a series of regional systems that were more locally focused and less elaborately interconnected. The Wendat Confederacy, the alliance of Iroquoian-speaking nations that French explorers encountered in the Georgian Bay region of Ontario in the early 17th century, was one of the downstream products of the post-Hopewell reorganization. The Wendat were sophisticated farmers who grew corn, beans, and squash in productive combination, who lived in substantial palisaded towns of several thousand people, who maintained complex trade networks connecting their agricultural surplus with the hunting economies of the Anishinaabe to the north and west. They had a sophisticated political organization, a decision-making system that managed the affairs of a confederacy of several nations with populations numbering in the tens of thousands. They had oral traditions of considerable depth and historical specificity. The Wendat oral accounts of their own history reach back to a time before the current social organization existed, to a period when the nations that would form the Confederacy were more dispersed, more mobile, more internally divided. They describe a process of coalescence, of coming together around shared values and shared organizational principles that was accomplished through the work of specific named figures in specific historical circumstances. The accounts of that process are detailed enough to have been compared with the archaeological record of Iroquoian cultural development in southern Ontario, and the comparison yields results that are historically meaningful. The sequence of events described in the oral tradition corresponds broadly to the archaeological sequence of Iroquoian settlement, pattern change, population, aggregation, and the development of the organizational complexity evident in the large late Iroquoian sites of the 14th and 15th centuries. Before the period described in the Wendat oral accounts of Confederacy formation, however, there are older layers of history that the accounts do not describe in the same genealogical detail. The Wendat knew they were descended from people who had been on the land for a very long time, who had developed the agricultural practices and the settlement patterns and the social structures that the Confederacy inherited. But the deep origin accounts, the traditions of where the Iroquoian peoples came from before they were the Iroquoian peoples in the form the historical record knows them, are more mythological in character, less genealogically specific, more clearly encoding a set of cosmological principles rather than a sequence of historical events. This is a common feature of traditions whose depth of time exceeds the genealogical memory that can be sustained in oral form. Beyond a certain horizon, individual event memory gives way to pattern memory, to accounts of how things came to be the way they are, rather than accounts of specific episodes in a historical sequence. The pattern memory of the Iroquoian traditions describes a people who came to the land they occupy from elsewhere, who learned the land from beings who were already in it, and who built their present way of life from a combination of what they brought and what they learned. The beings who were already in the land and who taught the newcomers are described in terms that place them in the category of prior peoples, beings whose relationship to the current world is one of precedence, rather than ancestry in the direct genealogical sense. The archaeological record of the Great Lakes region before the clearly documented Iroquoian cultural sequence is complex and not fully understood. The period from roughly 3,000 to 1,500 years ago, the Middle Woodland period, is characterized by a set of cultural traditions whose relationships to each other and to later cultural developments are matters of active research and ongoing revision. The Point Peninsula and Saugeen complexes of Ontario show evidence of connections to Hopewell ceremonialism combined with regional adaptations that reflect long familiarity with the specific resources of the Great Lakes environment. The populations producing this material culture were clearly not strangers to the land. They show the kind of localized knowledge and environmental adaptation that develops over long periods of sustained occupation. But before the Middle Woodland, in the period from roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, the archaeological record of the Great Lakes region thins considerably, not because people were absent, but because the material evidence they left is less durable, less visible in standard survey and excavation contexts, and less extensively surveyed. The shores of the Great Lakes themselves, which would have been the most productive and most intensively occupied locations during this period, have been substantially modified by the fluctuating water levels of the lakes over the past several thousand years, by the construction of major urban centers at the most productive lakeshore locations, and by centuries of agricultural land use that has plowed and eroded the surface layers where the most accessible evidence would be found. The deep history of the Great Lakes is literally under the cities that now occupy its shores. The question of what was on those shores, and who was there, and what they built and knew and organized, is one that cannot be answered fully by any currently available evidence. It can be approached through the indirect evidence of what came later, the Hopewell networks and the Iroquoian confederacies, which presuppose a prior development of the social and institutional foundations on which they were built. It can be approached through the oral traditions of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and the Wendat, which describe prior peoples and prior knowledge and prior organizational forms with enough specificity to constitute real historical evidence, even if that evidence cannot be independently confirmed at the level of detail the traditions provide. And it can be approached through the archaeological evidence of the Great Interior Lakes, particularly Lake Agassiz and its successors, whose shores supported human occupation for thousands of years before the lakes drained, and whose archaeological record is buried under the lake-bottom sediments of the Manitoba and Saskatchewan plains. The story of what was here before is ultimately a story about the relationship between time and evidence. Time is long. Human presence in Canada is at minimum 15,000 years old, and possibly substantially older. Evidence accumulates slowly, and it is damaged and destroyed by flooding and glaciation and erosion, and the deliberate practices of peoples who did not think it was worth preserving, and the deliberate practices of peoples who actively worked to make sure it would not be found. What remains is a fraction of what existed. What has been found is a fraction of what remains. And what has been interpreted correctly is a fraction of what has been found. Given all of that, what can be said with confidence is less than the full picture demands. But it is enough to support the following conclusions, stated plainly. The human history of Canada is substantially longer and substantially more complex than the standard narrative describes. The Indigenous peoples of Canada have preserved, in their oral traditions, accurate historical information about that deeper history, including information about prior peoples and prior civilizations that archaeologists are only now beginning to find the physical evidence to confirm. The loss of that history to flooding and displacement and deliberate cultural destruction is an irreversible loss of information about the human capacity for building knowledge and civilization under conditions very different from the ones that produce the civilizations that history usually discusses. And the recovery of what can still be recovered from the oral traditions and the physical record and the collaborative research that is beginning to happen between Indigenous communities and the scientific disciplines that can complement their knowledge is one of the most important intellectual projects of this generation. What was here was old. What was here was complex. What was here left traces in the landscape and in the memories of the people who came after. And those traces, read carefully and with respect for the sources that preserved them, are beginning to tell a story that deserves to be told. The footprints at Calvert Island are 14,000 years old. The people who made them had names. They had families. They knew that beach in ways that no one alive today knows it. They had stories about it, and about the landscape around it, and about the sky above it, and about the people who had lived there before them, because 14,000 years is enough time for there to have been many layers of people in the same place, each one inheriting something from the ones before, and passing something to the ones who came after. Some of what they passed forward got to us, not through an unbroken line, not without enormous loss at every stage, but something got through, the Heiltsuk oral tradition that pointed the archaeologists to that drowned beach, the Blackfoot star knowledge encoded in the medicine wheel on the hill above the plains, the Anishinaabe awareness of the pictograph makers who were there before them, the Cree accounts of the warm time and the people who lived in it, the Haudenosaunee acknowledgement of a world before the Confederacy that was organized differently and known in ways that the Confederacy could not fully access, the Mi'kmaq traditions of stone people who understood the rock in ways that ordinary humans did not, the Storlo accounts of transformer beings who fixed the landscape into its current form and locked away knowledge that was not yet safe to release. All of these traditions are fragments of a larger story. They fit together imperfectly because they were preserved independently, in different languages, in different cultural frameworks, under different conditions. But the shape they outline, when you look at them together, is not random. It is the shape of a human presence on this land that is far older, far more complex, and far more deeply engaged with the landscape than the standard narrative has acknowledged. It is the shape of something that was built here, over thousands of years, by people who understood their world, with an intimacy and a sophistication that we are only beginning to appreciate. And it is the shape of what was lost when that world was flooded, when the Great Lakes drained, when the networks collapsed, when the residential schools operated, when the languages died with their last speakers. The shape of what was lost is also the shape of what remains to be found. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough to matter, enough to change the story, enough to honor what was here before, and to take seriously the people who have been saying, for a very long time, that they remember it. They do remember. What they remember is real. And the work of listening to what they remember, and of looking for the physical traces of what they describe, is the work of giving the deep human history of Canada the attention and the respect it has always deserved. The sea floor holds the oldest evidence, the peat holds the climate archive, the stone holds the carved marks, the language holds the words that named things that no longer exist in the form they were named for, and the people hold the memory, imperfect and partial and irreplaceable, of a world that was here before this one, built by hands that have been gone for thousands of years, on land that the sea has covered, in a time that the standard histories did not think to look for. Look for it now. It is there. Most of it is still waiting to be found. The land remembers differently than people do. People remember in stories, in specific episodes, in the emotional weight of particular moments that get passed from one generation to the next, in the form of accounts shaped by the needs and the framings of each successive telling. The land remembers in layers. Pollen grains from plants that no longer grow in a given region, preserved in anaerobic lake sediments, tell the story of what the vegetation was. Isotope ratios in ice cores, drilled from glaciers that have been accumulating snow for hundreds of thousands of years, tell the story of what the atmosphere was and what the temperatures were. Geochemical signatures in stone tools tell the story of where the stone came from, and therefore something about the movement and the trade connections of the people who made the tools. The land's memory is not narrative. It does not have the shape of a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. It has the shape of a physical record, layered and partial, and distributed across an enormous geography, readable only by people who know what to look for and where to look and what instruments to use. The combination of the land's memory with the people's memory is what makes the recovery of Canada's deep human history possible. Neither one is sufficient alone. The land's memory, read without the context that the oral traditions provide, produces a collection of data points that does not resolve into a coherent historical picture without the addition of the social and cultural information that only the traditions can provide. The oral traditions, interpreted without the grounding that physical evidence provides, remain vulnerable to the accusation that they are simply stories, meaningful within the communities that hold them, but not independently confirmable as historical records. Together, tested against each other and found to be consistent, they produce something more reliable than either could produce separately. The methodology of using oral traditions as archaeological hypotheses has been described in academic literature under various names, but its essential logic is simple. The tradition says something happened somewhere. You look at that somewhere for physical evidence of the thing having happened. If you find it, the tradition's reliability as a historical source is supported, and the physical evidence gains interpretive context from the tradition. If you do not find it, you have not disproved the tradition, because the absence of physical evidence is not the same as the absence of the event, especially in the case of events that occurred in environments where evidence is poorly preserved. But the combination of multiple confirmed instances of oral traditions pointing to physical evidence that is subsequently found is a strong argument for taking the unconfirmed instances seriously as well. This is exactly the methodological situation in Canada right now. Multiple instances of oral traditions pointing to physical evidence that has been found and confirmed. The Hailtsuk tradition pointing to the drowned coastline. The Blackfoot astronomical tradition pointing to the medicine wheel alignments. The Anishinaabe tradition of prior pictograph makers pointing to the anomalous symbols at sites like Peterborough. The Inuit tradition of the Tuniat pointing to the Dorset archaeological sequence. Each confirmation increases the credibility of the oral traditions as a class, and by extension, increases the credibility of the specific claims within those traditions that have not yet been physically confirmed. The claim that there were prior peoples, more ancient than the current peoples, who built things and knew things that are now largely lost, is a claim made consistently across independent traditions from multiple nations with no documented contact with each other. The degree of convergence in independently preserved traditions is itself a form of evidence that should not be dismissed. The question of what those prior peoples were, taken as specifically as the evidence allows, is the question that the rest of the story has been circling. The most defensible answer, given what is currently known, is that they were not a single, unified civilization, but a set of related traditions of sophisticated human occupation and landscape management that developed independently in different regions of the continent over the period from the public initial peopling of North America to the various disruptions, environmental and social, that produced the cultural reorganizations visible in the archaeological record of the last 4,000 years. The Pacific coastal tradition, the interior plateau tradition, the Great Lakes woodland tradition, the boreal and subarctic traditions. Each of these represents an extended period of human engagement with a specific set of environmental conditions during which the relevant population developed specialized knowledge and organizational forms appropriate to those conditions. What connected these traditions, at various times and in various ways, were the exchange networks whose archaeological signatures are visible in the distribution of specific materials across enormous geographic distances. The old copper objects moving from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast and back. The obsidian from Yellowstone appearing in Ohio ceremonial contexts. The marine shells from the Pacific coast appearing in burial sites on the interior plateau. The shared ceremonial architecture of the Hopewell period appearing from Kansas City to the Ottawa Valley. These connections were maintained by people, by travelers and traders, and the exchange of knowledge as well as materials, and the people who maintained them were operating within social organizational frameworks capable of managing long-distance relationships across significant linguistic and cultural differences. The depth of the exchange networks, measured by the antiquity of the oldest confirmed examples, extends to the very beginning of the archaeologically documented occupation of Canada, and the oldest examples are limited only by the density of the survey work that has been done, not by any principled limit on how far back the connections might reach. The emergence of long-distance exchange is a feature of human social life that appears very early, as soon as populations are large and stable enough to develop the surplus and the institutional structures that make long-distance relationships maintainable. In the environments of Canada, those conditions existed from the beginning of post-glacial occupation for the most productive zones, and the evidence of early long-distance exchange is consistent with what the environmental conditions would predict. What the oral traditions of the coastal peoples preserve, among other things, is the memory of what those conditions produced during the thousands of years when the most productive environments were not where the current coastline is, but further out on the submerged continental shelf. The resource productivity of the pre-flooding coastal environment, combining the shelter of the inside passage with the exposure to the full upwelling productivity of the Pacific, was extraordinary. In that environment, over thousands of years, the peoples who lived there had the material conditions necessary to develop social and organizational forms of considerable sophistication. The oral traditions describing those peoples and that environment are the only surviving record of what was produced in those conditions, because the physical record is underwater, and because the populations that directly inhabited those environments were either drowned with the landscape or were sufficiently disrupted by the flooding that their organizational continuity was broken. What came after, on the higher ground of the current coast, was rebuilt. The BC coastal cultures at the time of European contact were sophisticated and complex by any measure, but they were working with the resource base of the current coastline, not the pre-flooding coastline, and they were building on the fragments of a prior tradition that had been disrupted rather than building on the full expression of a continuously developing tradition. The oral traditions that reached back through the disruption and preserved some memory of what came before were doing so across a significant break, a break that left gaps in the inheritance that are acknowledged within the traditions themselves. Understanding this is important not for the purpose of diminishing the achievements of the historical Indigenous cultures of Canada, which are substantial and impressive in their own right, but for the purpose of placing them in a longer temporal and developmental context that gives them their full historical significance. The Heiltsuk and the Haida and the Tsimshian and the Store and the Secwepemc are not simply the starting point of a developmental trajectory that, if it had been allowed to continue without interruption, might eventually have produced a recognizable civilization. They are the heirs of a developmental trajectory that was already very advanced when it was disrupted, and that has been recovering from that disruption for 10,000 years, and that was disrupted again in the 15th century by European contact and colonization, this time with the added destruction of the oral transmission systems that carried the deepest memory of the prior development. The depth of the recovery and the resilience of the traditions that sustained it is itself one of the most extraordinary features of Canadian human history. The knowledge systems that survived the flooding of the coastal shelves, the drainage of the interior lakes, the collapse of the Hopewell networks, the climate disruptions of the Middle Holocene, and the deliberate cultural destruction of the residential school era are not simply impressive as survivals. They are impressive as knowledge systems in themselves, containing within their surviving fragments information of genuine intellectual and historical significance, the astronomical knowledge, the ecological management practices, the geographic and navigational information, the organizational principles of the Confederacy systems, the pharmacological knowledge of the plant medicine traditions. These are not primitive or simple bodies of knowledge. They are sophisticated and practically effective systems developed through extended observation and experience in specific environments over very long periods of time. Recovering them fully is not possible. Recovering them partially is possible and is happening. Honoring them fully as the products of intellectual achievement of real significance and real antiquity is both possible and overdue. The final thing to say about the civilization or civilizations that Canada's first peoples spoke of as older than their own is something about what it means to lose something, not in the abstract philosophical sense, but in the specific historical sense of what it means when a way of knowing and a way of being in a place is disrupted or destroyed by forces larger than the communities that held it. What is lost is not just information, though information is lost. What is lost is the ongoing development of a particular way of being in relationship with a specific place, the accumulation of attention over thousands of years that produces a quality of knowing that cannot be replicated by any amount of study from the outside. The people who walked on that BC coastal shelf 14,000 years ago knew that beach, the way you can only know a place if your family has lived in it for generations, and if you have lived in it your whole life, and if the stories you were told from childhood were about that specific place, and the specific ways it behaves in specific seasons, and the specific dangers it presents in specific conditions, and the specific gifts it offers to people who know how to receive them. That quality of knowing is what is primarily lost when a people is displaced or destroyed. The information can sometimes be partially recovered, the knowing cannot. The oral traditions that survived are not a replacement for that knowing. They are a record of the fact that the knowing existed, carried in the form of stories that point at the knowing without fully containing it. The footprints at Calvert Island are not the knowing. They are evidence that someone who knew that beach pressed their feet into its mud on a specific day 14,000 years ago. The knowing itself walked away with the person, and the person is gone. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of accuracy, of being precise about what has been lost and what has been preserved, so that the work of recovery is calibrated appropriately, and the people doing it understand what they are working with and what they are working toward. What they are working with is real and significant. What they are working toward is a more complete and more accurate understanding of the deep human history of Canada, in the knowledge that the complete understanding is not available and will not be available, and that the partial understanding that is available is worth every effort required to achieve it. The cultures of Canada's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are not remnants, they are living traditions. They have survived everything that has been done to erase them, and they are changing in the ways that living things change, adapting to new conditions while maintaining continuity with what has made them what they are. The knowledge they hold about the deep history of the land they have occupied is not a museum artifact. It is a living body of information that is being actively maintained and actively transmitted, to the extent that the disruptions of the past century have allowed, and to the extent that the communities holding it have the resources and the security to do so. The question of whether Canada's first peoples spoke of a civilization older than their own has an answer that is yes, and the question of whether that civilization has been found also has an answer that is beginning to move from no to partly, and the trajectory of the research and the methodology and the collaboration that is producing that partial finding is toward a more complete yes over the coming generations. If the work is allowed to continue, and the resources are provided, and the relationships between the communities and the researchers are maintained with the care and the respect that they require, what was here before is not entirely gone. It is present in the landscape that holds the evidence. It is present in the languages that carry the memory. It is present in the traditions that have kept the knowledge of it alive through everything that has tried to end that knowledge. And it is present in the ongoing work of people who are listening to those traditions and looking at that landscape with the full force of their intellectual capacity and their methodological sophistication and their willingness to revise what they thought they knew in the light of what they are finding. This is how lost civilizations get found. Not all at once, and not in a single dramatic discovery, but slowly, through the accumulation of small conformations that add up over time to a substantially different picture than the one you started with. The picture that is emerging from the Canadian evidence is not yet complete. It may never be complete, but it is already different enough from the standard narrative that it demands to be told, and the telling of it is not just an academic exercise. It is a form of justice, a recognition that what was here was real and significant, and worthy of the attention and the respect that we give to the things we call civilization in other parts of the world. Canada's First Peoples spoke of a civilization older than their own. They have been speaking of it for a very long time. It is time to listen. If this journey into the deep past of Canada has kept you company tonight, whether you are falling asleep or just slowing down, then it has done what it was meant to do. These stories are older than any language I could use to tell them, and the people who held them through everything that tried to take them away deserve more than a single telling can give. If you want to hear more stories like this one, about the things that were here before history thought to look for them, you can subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Leave a comment if you can and tell me where in the world you are right now and what time it is where you are. Someone in Yellowknife, someone in Vancouver, someone in Halifax, someone in a city far from Canada who found their way here through curiosity, all of you listening to the same story under different skies. That is something worth knowing. This channel is a place for the long questions, the ones that do not have easy answers, but that are worth sitting with quietly until the edges of them become familiar. Thank you for being here. The record is still being read. What it says is still being understood. And somewhere on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, in 30 meters of dark cold water above a mudflat that has not seen sunlight in 14,000 years, 3 sets of human footprints are waiting for the next person who comes looking. The genetics of Canada's Indigenous peoples contain information about the deep human past of the continent that the oral traditions and the physical evidence alone cannot provide, and that information is not yet fully understood. The sequencing of ancient DNA from archaeological contexts across North America, combined with population genetics analysis of living Indigenous peoples, has produced a picture of the peopling of the continent that is considerably more complex than the single founding population model that dominated archaeological thinking for most of the 20th century. The current genetic understanding describes multiple distinct population inputs into the ancestry of living Indigenous peoples, inputs that diverged from each other tens of thousands of years ago in Siberia and that contributed to the North American gene pool through separate migration events at different times. There is a basal layer associated with the deepest ancestry of most Indigenous peoples of the Americas that diverged from East Asian populations sometime before 40,000 years ago. There are later inputs associated with specific population groups that appear to have entered the Americas after the initial settlement. And there are anomalous signals, genetic patterns, in some Indigenous populations that do not fit neatly into the framework of Asian-derived populations expanding through the Americas, patterns that have generated considerable academic debate about their source and their significance. The Haida of Haida Gwaii carry one of the most studied genomes in North American Indigenous genetics, partly because of the deep antiquity of their documented occupation of the archipelago, and partly because of their relative genetic isolation from later migrations. The Haida genome shows a pattern of deep divergence from other North American Indigenous populations that is consistent with a long period of geographic isolation, exactly what would be expected if the Haida, or their ancestors, occupied the ice-free refugium of Haida Gwaii through the last glacial maximum, while other populations were either south of the ice or isolated in different refugia. The specific branching point at which the Haida lineage diverges from other Indigenous lineages is a matter of ongoing genetic research, but the degree of divergence is consistent with a very early separation, one that could extend back to the initial peopling of the coast. The language of the Haida is itself one of the most significant linguistic puzzles in North America. Haida is a language isolate, a language with no demonstrated genealogical relationship to any other language family. This is not simply because the language is poorly studied or because the relevant comparisons have not been made. Haida has been extensively compared with other North American languages and with language families from Asia and elsewhere, and no relationship has been identified that meets the criteria for demonstrating genealogical connection. It stands alone. Like the Basque language of the Spanish-French border region, or the Sumerian language of ancient Mesopotamia, Haida is the product of a linguistic lineage that either never connected with any other surviving lineage or connected so long ago that the shared elements are no longer recoverable. A language isolate in a region with deep genetic isolation and strong oral traditions of ancient occupation is exactly what you would expect to find if a population had been in a place long enough and isolated enough to develop a completely independent linguistic tradition from scratch. The Haida language, in other words, is itself a piece of evidence for the antiquity of Haida presence on the coast of British Columbia, evidence that is consistent with the oral traditions, consistent with the genetics, and consistent with the archaeological record of continuous occupation on Haida Gwaii, extending back to the earliest post-glacial period. The Kootenai of the southern BC interior are another language isolate. The Kootenai language has no demonstrated relationship to any of the surrounding language families, neither the Salishan languages of the coast and interior, nor the Algonquian languages of the east, nor the Athapascan languages of the north. The Kootenai occupy a specific geographic niche in the mountain and valley country of the BC-Montana border, and their oral traditions describe a deep connection to that landscape that is consistent with very long occupation. The geographic isolation of their territory, in the intermontane valleys between major mountain ranges, could plausibly have sustained the linguistic isolation that produced a language with no living relatives. The existence of multiple language isolates in what is now Canada, independent of each other and independent of all surrounding language families, is a significant piece of evidence for the depth and the complexity of pre-contact human occupation of the continent. Language isolates do not form in short periods of time. A language that is the product of normal divergence from a parent language retains traces of that relationship that are identifiable by systematic linguistic comparison. A language that has been isolated long enough for all such traces to disappear has been isolated for a very long time. The minimum time required for a language to lose all demonstrable relationship to its ancestors, under the most favorable conditions for identifying such relationships, is generally estimated at around 10,000 years. Languages isolated for longer than that will simply appear to have no relatives, which is the situation of the Haida and the Kootenai and the other North American language isolates. Taken together, the genetic evidence, the linguistic evidence, the oral traditional evidence, and the physical archaeological evidence all point in the same direction. The human occupation of what is now Canada is old. It is not a recent arrival, followed by a brief developmental sequence leading to the cultures encountered by Europeans. It is a deep, complex, and sophisticated multi-millennia presence on the land, with multiple distinct population lineages that diverged from each other and from outside populations at different times, and that developed distinct cultural and linguistic traditions appropriate to their specific geographic situations. Within that long presence, there are periods and places and organizational forms that deserve the description civilization in the broad sense of the term: sustained, sophisticated, organized, productive engagement with a specific environment that generates accumulated knowledge, complex social organization, and material culture of real accomplishment. The coastal traditions of British Columbia. The interior plateau traditions, centered on communities like Keatley Creek. The boreal and subarctic traditions of the Cree and Dene and their predecessors. The Great Lakes woodland traditions that connected to the broader Hopewell network. The Arctic traditions of the Dorset and the Thule. Each of these, in its specific time and place and environmental context, represents a human achievement that is worthy of the same serious attention we give to the civilizations of the Old World, and that has not received that attention, because the standard narrative of North American history was constructed in ways that systematically minimized and obscured it. The process of reconstructing that attention, of building a historical and archaeological understanding of pre-contact Canada adequate to the actual complexity and depth of what existed here, is not complete. It is in some respects just beginning, but it is happening, and the rate at which it is happening is accelerating as new methods are applied to new questions, as old methods are applied to previously ignored evidence, and as the collaborative relationships between Indigenous communities and outside researchers that produce the most significant findings are being established and maintained with greater care and greater mutual respect than was typical in earlier generations of research. The story that is emerging from that research is not a simple story of a lost civilization suddenly discovered. It is a complex story of multiple distinct but interconnected human traditions, developing over very long periods of time in different parts of a continent of enormous geographic diversity, connected by trade and ceremonial exchange and the movement of people and ideas across the distances that separated them, disrupted by environmental catastrophes that destroyed the evidence of the most developed expressions of those traditions, and carried forward imperfectly but faithfully by the peoples who survived those disruptions and who are still here, still holding the memories, still engaged with the land that their ancestors knew in ways that reach back further than any written record, and that are only now beginning to receive the recognition and the investigation they deserve. That is the story. It is not finished. It will not be finished in any of our lifetimes, because the telling of it depends on the recovery of evidence that is still in the ground and under the water and in the memories of people who are still alive, and the recovery of that evidence is a project that will span generations. But enough of the story is visible now to say with confidence that what was here was real and old and significant, and that the people who have been saying so for as long as anyone has been listening were right. They were right about the drowned coastline. They were right about the flooded beaches where their ancestors walked. They were right about the astronomical alignments in the medicine wheels on the hills. They were right about the pictograph makers who were there before them. They were right about the Tuniat who fled before the Thule. They were right about the great water that covered the plains. They were right about all of it, in the imperfect and fragmentary way that being right across thousands of years of oral transmission makes you right, which is to say, right enough for the physical evidence to confirm the core of what the tradition was preserving, when the physical evidence is finally examined with the care it deserves. The care it deserves is finally, slowly being applied. And what is being found is confirming what was always said by the people who knew the land longest and who carried the memory of it through everything that tried to take that memory away. What was here was old. What was here was complex. What was here left marks in the landscape and in the traditions of the people who came after, and those marks are being read now, for the first time, with the full attention they deserve. The footprints in the mud, the stone figures on the hill, the symbols on the cliff face, the songs that remember the names of stars that the ancestors watched from shores that are now under 30 feet of ocean, the stories about the people who came before. The stories begin, all of it pointing at something real, something that was here and is not gone, not entirely, not yet. Something that is, in the most literal sense of the word, still being found. The ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet are one of the most extraordinary archives of past climate in the world. The ice that accumulates on the Greenland summit each year traps air bubbles containing the atmosphere of that year, traps dust and pollen blown in from distant landscapes, traps chemical signals from volcanic eruptions, and ocean spray, and the burning of vegetation. Reading down through the ice is reading backward through time with extraordinary resolution, each annual layer to a thin page in a climate history that extends back more than 800,000 years. The cores that have been drilled and analysed by teams from multiple countries over the past several decades contain information about past climate states whose precision and resolution have transformed the understanding of how climate changes and what drives those changes. What the Greenland cores show, relevant to the story of Canada's deep human past, is that the climate of the past 15,000 years has not been the stable, slowly varying background that earlier models assumed. It has been punctuated by abrupt events, rapid shifts in temperature and precipitation that happened over periods of decades rather than centuries or millennia, that reached across the northern hemisphere and affected human populations in ways that must have been dramatic and sometimes catastrophic. The 8.2 kiloyear event, which marked the final catastrophic drainage of Lake Agassiz and Lake Ojibwe into the North Atlantic around 8,200 years ago, shows up in the Greenland ice as one of the most dramatic cold events of the Holocene, a temperature drop of several degrees that persisted for roughly 160 years before conditions returned to their previous state. 160 years is several human generations, long enough for populations that were organized around specific climate conditions to experience serious disruption. to be forced to adapt or relocate, to lose organizational structures that depended on the stability of conditions that no longer existed. The peoples who were living on the shores of the draining lakes and the flooding coasts during this period were experiencing exactly the kind of cumulative civilizational disruption that the oral traditions describe. The 8.2 kilo-year event added a century and a half of cold and reduced precipitation to the already massive disruption of the lake draining and the coastal flooding. The combination was sufficient to have ended the most productive phases of multiple regional cultural traditions and to have forced a reorganization of the patterns of occupation and social organization across much of Canada. That reorganization played out over the period from roughly 8,000 to 5,000 years before the present, is visible in the archaeological record as a period of relative simplicity compared with what came before and after. The complex organizational systems of the early Holocene coastal and lakeside traditions were disrupted. The exchange networks that had connected widely separated communities contracted. Settlement patterns changed, with populations moving away from the disrupted zones and adapting to conditions in higher, more stable terrain. The material culture of the period reflects this reorganization, with less evidence of long-distance exchange and more evidence of local adaptation. What came after, from roughly 5,000 years ago to the time of European contact, was the rebuilding phase. The period during which the populations that had survived the early Holocene disruptions developed the complex cultural traditions that Europeans encountered. The Hopewell Network, the Pacific coastal chiefdom systems, the Iroquoian agricultural communities, the boreal hunting and gathering traditions of the Cree and Dene and their neighbors, the Arctic traditions of the Dorset and the Thule. All of these were sophisticated and, in some respects, complex civilizations. But they were all products of the rebuilding phase, not of the full developmental trajectory that had been underway before the disruptions of the early Holocene. Understanding the deep human history of Canada therefore requires holding two timelines in mind simultaneously. The timeline of the rebuilding, from 5,000 years ago to the present, which is the timeline that most of the archaeological and historical record documents, and the timeline of what came before the disruptions, from the initial peopling of the continent to the early Holocene catastrophes, which is the timeline that the oral traditions remember and that the physical evidence is only beginning to recover. The second timeline is longer and in many ways more significant, but it is also far more poorly documented, and the gap between what happened in that first phase of North American human history and what is currently known about it is the gap that the research described throughout this story is attempting to bridge. The bridge is being built, slowly, from both ends. The oral traditions reaching back as far as they can maintain their specificity, becoming more general and more cosmological as they approach the limits of what individual and collective memory can preserve across the spans of time involved. The physical evidence reaching forward from the oldest confirmed sites, filling in the picture with a density and a specificity that increases as the tools for finding and analyzing the evidence improve. The point at which the two ends of the bridge meet, where the oral traditions find their physical confirmation and the physical evidence finds its cultural and historical interpretation, is moving. It moved with the Heiltsuk footprints. It moved with the Majorville astronomical analysis. It will move again with the next underwater survey that finds what the oral traditions say is there. The bridge is real. The building of it is the most important intellectual project currently underway in the field of Canadian pre-contact history. And every confirmed connection between what the oral traditions say and what the physical evidence shows strengthens the case for taking both sources seriously in the places where they have not yet been confirmed, the underwater sites not yet surveyed, the boreal territories not yet systematically studied, the oral accounts not yet systematically tested against the physical record. What was here before is not a question with a complete answer. It may never have a complete answer, but the partial answers that are accumulating are enough to say with confidence that the standard narrative in which the deep human history of Canada is a story of small, simple, pre-civilizational peoples leaving minimal traces in a vast and largely uninhabited land is not just incomplete, it is wrong. And replacing it with a more accurate account, one that gives the deep past of this country the depth and the complexity it actually had, is work that matters not just for the historical record, but for the living communities whose identities and rights and relationships with the land are grounded in the truth of that history. The truth is that they were here. They built things. They knew things. They cared for the land in ways that kept it productive for generations beyond counting. And what they built and knew and cared for deserves to be understood and honored in its full depth and its full complexity, not reduced to a footnote in a history that was written without them, and that is only now, slowly, being rewritten to include what they have always been saying. That is the story. It is not over. It is, in the most precise sense of the word, ongoing. The footprints are waiting. The stories are being told. The surveys are being planned. The collaborations are being formed. The understanding is being built. It is enough to know that the work is happening, and it is enough to know that what the work is finding is confirming what was always said by the people who knew the land longest. What was here was real. What was here was old. What was here was worth knowing, and the knowing of it is still possible. For those who are willing to look, there is something particular about the way the Canadian landscape holds its secrets. The land itself is physically vast in a way that affects how people think about what it contains. The sheer scale of the country, the distances between things, the density of the forest, the depth of the water, the thickness of the permafrost, all of these conspire to produce a landscape that feels unexamined even when it has been extensively surveyed, because the surveys that have been done are small relative to the territory that remains. A researcher who has spent a career studying one river drainage in northern Ontario knows that river drainage extremely well, and knows almost nothing about the 50 river drainages of similar size that surround it. The knowledge is highly local and highly specific, and the gaps between known areas are simply unmeasured, not empty. This characteristic of Canadian archaeology, the extreme local specificity of what is known, surrounded by enormous geographic areas of genuine ignorance, makes it very difficult to construct the kind of synthetic overview that would be needed to really understand the scale and the complexity of what the pre-contact landscape of Canada contained. The researchers who know the BC coastal archaeology best are not the same researchers who know the Ontario woodland sequence, who are not the same researchers who know the Boreal Cree territory, who are not the same researchers who know the Arctic. The professional structure of archaeology produces local expertise and large-scale ignorance simultaneously, and the large-scale ignorance is where the prior civilizations hide. The Algonquian language family, which includes Cree, Ojibwe, Blackfoot, Mi'kmaq, and dozens of other languages spoken across an enormous swath of Canada from the Rockies to the Atlantic, is itself evidence of a deep and wide-ranging human presence. Language families do not spread across continental distances unless the populations speaking them either had very long periods of unobstructed expansion or maintained very dense networks of communication across the full extent of their territory. The Algonquian languages are diverse enough internally to indicate a very long period of independent development in different regions, but also similar enough in their fundamental structures to indicate a common origin that was itself already complex and well developed. The Proto-Algonquian language, the reconstructed ancestor of all current Algonquian languages, was not a simple or primitive language. It had a complex grammar, a rich vocabulary for describing the natural world, and the organizational sophistication to support the exchange networks whose material evidence is visible in the archaeological record. The Athapascan language family, which includes Dene, Navajo, and Apache, among many others, and which spans an enormous geographic area from Alaska to the American Southwest, presents a similar picture. The Athapascan languages are significant for maintaining a high degree of structural similarity across a geographic spread that encompasses multiple very different environments and ecological zones. This structural conservatism suggests either relatively recent geographic expansion from a specific core area or extraordinary maintenance of linguistic connection across great distances over a very long period. The debate about which of these explanations is correct is ongoing in historical linguistics, but either explanation is consistent with the general picture of a deep and organizationally sophisticated human presence in the relevant territories. The diversity of language families in Canada, the Algonquian and Athapascan and Salishan and Siouan and Iroquoian and the various isolates, is itself a measure of the depth of human occupation. Linguistic diversity of this magnitude takes time to develop. The processes that produce language families and language isolates, divergence and isolation, and the accumulation of independent changes over long periods, are slow. The current linguistic map of Canada, even accounting for the disruptions and language losses of the past 5 centuries, reflects a human presence on the land that is measured in tens of thousands of years, not thousands, and that maintained sufficient geographic stability in its core areas for local linguistic traditions to develop their distinctive characters over that span. The linguistic evidence is one of the lines of evidence that reaches furthest back, and that is the hardest to reconcile with the short timelines that were standard in the archaeological literature for most of the 20th century. If the diversity of North American languages developed from a founding population that arrived only 13,000 years ago, the development rates implied are far faster than anything observed in historical linguistics in other parts of the world. The diversity looks more like the product of 30 or 40,000 years of development, or of multiple founding populations that were already linguistically diverse when they arrived, or both. The genetics are pointing in the direction of the second explanation, with multiple distinct founding populations arriving at different times. The linguistics are consistent with the first and the second explanations combined. The oral traditions, which describe layered presences on the land extending back further than the traditions themselves can measure, are consistent with the picture produced by combining the genetic and linguistic evidence. The convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence on a consistent picture is one of the most powerful arguments for taking that picture seriously. When genetics and linguistics and oral traditions and archaeology all point in the same direction, the direction they are pointing in is almost certainly closer to the truth than any of them alone could establish. The direction they are pointing in for Canada is toward a human presence that is deep, complex, and sophisticated, that produced achievements worthy of the name civilization in multiple regions and periods, that was disrupted and partially destroyed by a combination of environmental catastrophe and deliberate cultural erasure, and that persists in the surviving traditions and the physical record in ways that reward careful and respectful attention. The ceremonies that mark the relationship between human communities and the land they occupy are one of the most direct expressions of this deep presence. The ceremonies of the Pacific coastal peoples, the potlatch, and the associated ceremonial complex are not simply cultural practices in the sense of arbitrary customs. They are sophisticated social technologies that manage resource distribution, maintain political relationships, and encode historical information in forms that can be transmitted across generations. The potlatch tradition, which European colonial governments banned from 1885 to 1951 on the grounds that it was economically wasteful and culturally backward, is now recognized as a brilliantly designed system for managing the kind of complex social relationships that dense, settled, resource-rich communities produce. Its prohibition was not just culturally destructive, it was an attack on one of the most effective social management technologies developed anywhere on the continent. The land management ceremonies of the interior plateau peoples, the first salmon ceremonies, and the root feasts and the berry-picking protocols are similarly sophisticated technologies for managing relationships between human communities and the specific resource systems they depend on. The ceremonies encode ecological information, management rules, and social protocols in forms that can be transmitted reliably across generations. They are not simply symbolic, they have practical effects on resource management that contribute to the long-term sustainability of the resource base. The burning practices of the BC coastal and interior peoples, managed through ceremonial protocols as well as through practical knowledge, maintain the mosaic of habitats that supported the diversity of species the peoples depended on. Removing those practices, which colonization did by removing the peoples who conducted them, produced detectable changes in the ecology of the affected landscapes within decades. The relationship between ceremony and land management is not a quaint feature of pre-modern peoples. It is a technology, as real and as effective as any material technology, for maintaining the conditions that make complex human life in a specific place sustainable over very long periods of time. The civilizations that developed without sustainable land management technologies tend to collapse within a few centuries. The civilizations that developed effective, sustainable land management technologies can persist for much longer. The pre-contact peoples of Canada, across multiple distinct regional traditions, developed effective, sustainable land management technologies encoded in ceremonial form, and those technologies sustained complex human presence in the relevant territories for periods that dwarf the duration of most Old World civilizations. This is the final point that the deep human history of Canada makes most clearly, and it is the point that is most relevant to the present. The prior peoples of this land, the ones spoken of in the oral traditions as older than the current peoples, were not simply interesting as historical artifacts. They were successful as civilizations, in the most meaningful sense of the word, which is that their way of organizing life in relationship to the land was sustainable over very long periods of time. They built things that lasted, not just in stone or copper, but in ecological relationships and ceremonial structures and knowledge systems that maintained the conditions for human life in their territories across spans of time that no urban civilization has yet matched. What they built is worth finding. What they knew is worth recovering. And the people who remember it, however imperfectly, across however many disruptions and losses, are worth listening to with the full attention and the full respect that any serious source of historical knowledge deserves. The footprints in the mud at Calvert Island are the most literal version of the evidence. Someone was there. They were real. They walked on land that is now underwater, in a world that no longer exists in the form they knew it, and they left behind, in the preserved sediment of a sheltered mudflat, the undeniable evidence of their presence. Every tradition that has been pointing at that presence for 14,000 years was pointing accurately. Every tradition that points at presences we have not yet found the physical evidence for may be pointing just as accurately. The work of listening and looking for what they are pointing at is the work that the deep human history of Canada demands, and it is work that is finally, slowly, underway. The stories are older than the language used to tell them. The land is older than the stories. And somewhere in the relationship between the land and the stories, and the people who have held both through everything that has tried to separate them, the full history of Canada's deep human past is still present, waiting for the attention it has always deserved. What was here was old. What was here was complex. What was here is not entirely gone. And the people who remember it are still here, still saying so. The work of recovering the deep human history of Canada is work that belongs to everyone who lives on this land and who benefits from understanding where they are and how long people have been here and what they built in the time before. The historical record begins. It belongs to researchers and to communities and to governments and to ordinary people who are curious about the full truth of the place they inhabit. It belongs, most of all, to the communities whose traditions have preserved the memory of that history through everything that has tried to erase it, and whose ongoing relationship with the land is the living expression of a continuity that extends back further than any written record reaches. The oral traditions of Canada's Indigenous peoples are not simply historical sources. They are living knowledge, actively maintained and actively transmitted, changing in the ways that living knowledge changes while preserving the core of what has always been essential. They are the most durable archive of human experience in this part of the world, having survived the flooding of the coastlines and the draining of the lakes and the collapse of the exchange networks and the deliberate attack of the residential school system. What they contain is irreplaceable, and what they point toward is still, in significant measure, findable. Find it. Look where the traditions point. Listen to what they say with the full rigor of scientific method and the full respect of genuine intellectual partnership. The footprints are there, in the dark water, under the sediment, where the stories have always said they would be. The civilization that was spoken of is there, in fragments, in layers, in the land's own memory and the people's memory together. The finding of it is the work of this generation, and of the generations to come, and it is work that is worth doing with everything that can be brought to it. What was here is still here, in the only forms that survived. Honor those forms. Study them seriously. End quote. Treat the people who hold them with the respect due to the custodians of the longest continuous human relationship with this land anywhere on earth. And understand that what they are offering, in sharing what they hold, is one of the most significant gifts that any living tradition can offer to a world trying to understand its own past. The story is not over. It has barely begun to be told properly. And the telling of it, done with care and rigor and respect, will change what it means to live in this place and to understand what this place has been across the full depth of human time. What was here was old. What was here was complex. What was here left marks. Those marks are being found. And the finding of them, one by one, slow and patient and collaborative, is the most honest way to honor the civilization that the stories have always remembered and that the land has always held. The work continues. The L